shaking up, to which fantasy, reason, memory, and other faculties of the same order succumb in our dreams. In the further discussion of the subject, we find in both these groups of authors remarkable evasions and inconsequences. Strictly speaking, all interest in immoral dreams should be at an end for those who assert that the moral personality of the individuals fall to pieces in their dreams. They could as coolly reject all attempts to hold the dreamer responsible for his dreams, or to infer from the immorality of his dreams that there is an immoral stain in his character, as they have rejected the apparently analogous attempt to prove from the absurdity of his dreams the worthlessness of his intellectual life in the waking state. The others, according to whom the categorical imperative extends even into the dream, ought to accept in total the notion of full responsibility for immoral dreams, and we can only hope that their reprehensible dreams do not lead them to abandon their otherwise firm belief in their own moral worth. As a matter of fact, however, it would seem that although no one is positively certain how good or bad he is, he can hardly deny that he can recollect immoral dreams of his own. That there are such dreams no one denies, the only question is, how do they originate? So that in spite of their conflicting judgments of dream morality, both groups of authors are at pains to explain the genesis of the immoral dream, and here a new conflict arises, as to whether its origin is to be sought in the normal functions of the physic life, or in the somatically conditioned encroachments upon this life. The nature of the facts compel both those who argue for and those who argue against moral responsibility in dream life to agree in recognizing a special psychic source for the immorality of dreams. Those who maintain that morality continues to function in our dream life nevertheless refrain from assuming full responsibility for their dreams. Hafner says, "We are not responsible for our dreams because that basis which alone gives our life truth and reality is withdrawn from our thoughts and our will. Hence the wishes and actions of our dreams cannot be virtuous or sinful. Yet the dreamer is responsible for the sinful dream insofar as indirectly he brings it about. Thus, as in waking state, it is his duty just before going to sleep morally to cleanse his mind." The analysis of this admixture of denial and recognition of responsibility for the moral content of dreams is carried much further by Hildebrandt. After arguing that the dramatic method of representation characteristic of his dreams, the condensation of the most complicated processes of reflection into the briefest periods of time, and the debasement and confusion of the imaginative elements of dreams, which even he admits must allow for, in some respect, the immoral appearance of the dreams, he nevertheless confesses that there are the most serious objections to flatly denying all responsibility for the lapses and offenses of which we are guilty in our dreams. If we wish to repudiate very decisively any sort of unjust accusation, and especially one which has reference to our intentions and convictions, we use the expression, "We should never have dreamt of such a thing." By this, it is true, we mean on one hand that we consider the region of the dreams the last and remotest place in which we could be held responsible for our thoughts, because these thoughts are so loosely and incoherently connected with our real being that we can, after all, hardly regard them as our own, but inasmuch as we feel impelled expressly to deny the existence of such thoughts even in this region, we are at the same time indirectly admitting that our justification would not be complete unless it extended even thus far. And I believe that here, although unconsciously, we are speaking the language of truth. No dream action can be imagined whose first beginnings have not in some shape already passed through the mind during our waking hours in the form of wish, desire, or impulse. Concerning this original impulse we must say, the dream has not discovered it, it has only imitated and extended it. It has only elaborated into dramatic form a scrap of historical material which it found already existing within us. It brings to our mind the words of the apostle that he who hates his brother is a murderer. And though, after we wake, being conscious of our moral strength, we may smile at the whole widely elaborated structure of the depraved dream, yet the original material out of which we formed it cannot be laughed away. One feels responsible for the transgressions of one's dreaming self, not for the whole sum of them, but yet for a certain percentage. In short, if we in this sense can hardly be impugned, we understand the words of Christ, that out of the heart come evil thoughts, that we can hardly help being convinced that every sin committed in our dreams brings with it at least a vague minimum of guilt. Thus Hildebrandt finds the source of the immorality of dreams in the germs and hints of evil impulses which pass through our minds during the day as mental temptations, and he does not hesitate to include these immoral elements in the ethical evaluation of the personality. These same thoughts and the same evaluation of these thoughts have, as we know, caused devout and holy men of all ages to lament that they were wicked sinners. It is not uninteresting to consider the attitude of the Inquisition to this problem. In the Tractatus de Officio Sententiam Inquisitis of Thomas Carina, one finds the following passage. Should anyone utter hearsays in his dreams, the inquisitors shall consider this a reason for investigating his conduct in life, for that which is wont to return in sleep, which occupies a man during the day. Dr. Edinger, St. Urban, Switzerland. The general occurrence of these contrasting thoughts in the majority of men, and even in other regions than the ethical, is of course established beyond a doubt. They have sometimes been judged in a less serious spirit. Spitta quotes a relevant passage from A. Zeller. An intellect is rarely so happily organized as to be in full command of itself at all times and seasons, and never to be disturbed in the lucid and constant processes of thought by ideas not merely unessential, but absolutely grotesque and nonsensical. Indeed, the greatest thinkers have had cause to complain of this dreamlike, tormenting, and distressing ramble of ideas, which disturbs their profoundest contemplations and their most pious and earnest meditations. A clearer light is thrown on the psychological meaning of these contrasting thoughts by a further observation of Hildebrandt, to the effect that dreams permit us an occasional glimpse of the deepest and innermost recesses of our being, which are generally closed to us in this waking state. A recognition of this fact is betrayed by Kant in his Anthropology, when he states that our dreams may perhaps be intended to reveal to us not what we are, but what we might have been if we had had another upbringing, and by Radstock, who suggests that our dreams disclose to us what we do not wish to admit to ourselves, and that we therefore unjustly condemn them as lying and deceptive. J. E. Erdmann asserts, "A dream has never told me what I ought to think of a person, but, to my great surprise, a dream has more than once taught me what I do really think of him and feel about him." And J. H. Fitch expresses himself in a like manner. The character of our dreams gives a far truer reflection of our general disposition than anything which we can learn by self-observation in the waking state. Such remarks as this of Benini's call attention to the fact that the emergence of impulses which are foreign to our ethical consciousness is merely analogous to the manner already familiar to us in which the dream disposes of other representative material. Volquet expresses himself in a similar fashion. Even ideas which have entered into our consciousness almost unnoticed, and which, perhaps, it has never been before called out of oblivion, often announce their presence in the mind through a dream. Finally, we may remember that, according to Schleiermacher, the state of the falling asleep is accompanied by the appearance of undesired imaginings. We may include in such undesired imaginings the whole of that imaginative material the occurrence of which surprises us in immoral as well as in absurd dreams. The only important difference consists in the fact that the undesired imaginings in the moral sphere as in opposition to our usual feelings, whereas the others merely appear strange to us. So far nothing has been done to enable us to reconcile this difference by a profounder understanding. But what is the significance of the emergence of undesired representations in dreams? What conclusions can the psychology of the waking and dreaming mind draw from these nocturnal manifestations of contrasting ethical impulses? Here we find a fresh diversity of opinion, and also a different grouping of the authors who have treated the subject. The line of thought followed by Hildebrandt, and by others who share his fundamental opinion, cannot be continued otherwise than by ascribing to the immoral impulses, even in the waking state, a latent vitality, which is indeed inhibited from proceeding to action, and by asserting that during sleep something falls away from us, which, having the effect of an inhibition, has kept us from becoming aware of the existence of such impulses. Dreams, therefore, reveal the true, if not the whole, nature of the dreamer, and are one means of making the hidden life of the psyche accessible to our understanding. It is only on such hypotheses that Hildebrandt can attribute to the dream the role of a monitor who calls our attention to the secret mischief in the soul, just as, according to physicians, it may announce a hitherto unobserved physical disorder. Spitta, too, must be influenced by this conception which he refers, for example, to the stream of excitations which flow in upon the psyche during puberty, and consoles the dreamer by assuring him that he has done all that is in his power if he has led a strictly virtuous life during his waking state, if he has made an attempt to suppress the sinful thoughts as often as they arise, and has kept them from maturing and turning into action. According to this conception, we may designate as undesired imaginings those that are suppressed during the day. We must recognize that in their emergence a genuine psychic phenomenon. According to certain other authors, we have no right to draw this last inference. For Justin, the undesired ideas and images in the dream as in the waking state, and also in the delirium of fever, etc., possess the character of a voluntary activity laid to rest, and of a procession, to some extent mechanical, of images and ideas evoked by inner impulses. An immoral dream proves nothing in respect of the psychic life of the dreamer except that he has somehow become cognizant of the imaginative content in question. It is certainly no proof of a psychic impulse of his own mind. Another writer, Maury, makes us wonder whether he, too, does not ascribe to the dream state the power of dividing the psychic activity into its components instead of aimlessly destroying it. He speaks as follows of dreams in which one oversteps the bounds of morality. Translation: Our tendencies speak and make us act without being restrained by our conscience, although it sometimes warns us. I have my faults and vicious tendencies. Awake, I try to fight against them, and often enough I do not succumb to them. But in my dreams I always succumb, or rather I act at their direction without fear or remorse. Les Simoly, page 113. Evidently the visions which unfold in my dreams, and which constitute the dream, are suggested by the stimuli which I feel, and which my absent will does not try to repel. If one believed in the power of the dream to reveal an actually existing, but suppressed or concealed immoral disposition of the dreamer, one could not express one's opinion more emphatically than in the words of Maury, page 115. Translation: In a dream, a man is totally revealed to himself in his naked and wretched state. As he suspends the exercise of his will, he becomes a toy of all the passions from which, when awake, our conscious horror and fear defend us. He then mentions, as an example, that his own dreams often reveal him as a victim of just those superstitions which he has most vigorously attacked in his writings. The value of all these acute observations is, however, impaired in Maury's case, because he refuses to recognize in the phenomena which he has so accurately observed anything more than proof of the automasme psychologique which, in his own opinion, dominates the dream life. He conceives this automasm as the complete opposite of the psychic activity. A passage in Stricker's Subrin über das Bewusstsein reads, Dreamers do not consist purely and simply of delusions. For example, if one is afraid of robbers in a dream, the robbers indeed are imaginary, but the fear is real. Our attention is here called to the fact that the effective development of a dream does not admit of the judgment which one bestows upon the rest of the dream content, and the problem then arises: what part of the psychic processes in a dream may be real? That is to say, what part of them may claim to be enrolled among the psychic processes of the waking state. End of section 7.
Section 8 of the Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Malone. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. Brill. Chapter 1, Section G. Dream Theories and the Function of the Dream. A statement concerning the dream which seeks to explain as many as possible of its observed characteristics from a single point of view, and which at the same time defines the relation of the dream to a more comprehensive sphere of phenomena, may be described as a theory of the dream. The individual theories of the dream will be distinguished from one another by their designating as essential this or that characteristic of dreams, and relating thereto their data and their explanations. It is not absolutely necessary that we should deduce from the theory of the dream a function, that is, a use or any such similar role, but expectation, being as a matter of habit, teleologically inclined will nevertheless welcome these theories, which afford us some insight into a function of dreams. We have already become acquainted with many conceptions of the dream, which in this sense are more or less deserving of the name of dream theories. The belief of the ancients that dreams were sent by the gods in order to guide the actions of man was a complete theory of the dream, which told them all that was worth knowing about dreams. Since dreams have become an object of biological research, we have a greater number of theories, some of which, however, are very incomplete. Provided we make no claim to completeness, we might venture on the following rough grouping of dream theories, based on their fundamental conception of the degree and mode of the psychic activity in dreams. 1. Theories like those of Delboeuf, which allow the full psychic activity of the waking state to continue in our dreams. Here the psyche does not sleep. Its apparatus remains intact, but under the conditions of the sleeping state, which differ from those of the waking state. It must, in its normal functioning, give results which differ from those of the waking state. As regards these theories, it may be questioned whether their authors are in a position to derive the distinction between dreaming and waking thought entirely from the conditions of the sleeping state. Moreover, they lack one possible access to a function of dreams. One does not understand to what purpose one dreams, why the complicated mechanism of the psychic apparatus should continue to operate even when it is placed under conditions to which it does not appear to be adapted. There are only two purposeful reactions in the place of the reaction of dreaming: to sleep dreamlessly, or to wake when affected by disturbing stimuli. 2. Theories which, on the contrary, assume for the dream a diminution of the psychic activity, a loosening of connections, and an impoverishment of the available material. In accordance with these theories, one must assume for sleep a psychological character entirely different from that given by Delboeuf. Sleep encroaches widely upon the psyche. It does not consist in the mere shutting it off from the outer world. On the contrary, it enters into its mechanism and makes it, for the time being, unserviceable. If I may draw a comparison from psychiatry, I would say that the first group of theories construes the dream like a paranoia, while the second represents it as a type of mental deficiency or amentia. The theory that only a fragment of the psychic activity paralyzed by sleep finds expression in dreams is that by far the most favored by medical writers and by scientists in general. Insofar as one may presuppose a general interest in dream interpretation, one may indeed describe it as the most popular theory of dreams. It is remarkable how nimbly this particular theory avoids the greatest danger that threatens every dream interpretation, that is, shipwreck on one of the contrasts incorporated in dreams. Since this theory regards dreams as the result of a partial waking, or as Herbert puts it in his Psychologie über den Traum, a gradual, partial, and at the same time very anomalous waking, it is able to cover the whole series from the inferior activities of dreams, which betray themselves by their absurdity, to fully concentrated intellectual activity, by a series of states of progressive awakening, ending in complete wakefulness. Those who find the psychological mode of expression indispensable, or who deem it more scientific, We'll find this theory of dreams summarized in Binz's description, page 43. The state of torpor, however, gradually comes to an end in the hours of early morning. The accumulated products of fatigue in the albumin of the brain gradually diminish. They are slowly decomposed or carried away by the constantly flowing bloodstream. Here and there, individual groups of cells can be distinguished as being awake, while around them all is still in a state of torpidity. The isolated work of the individual groups now appears before our clouded consciousness, which is still powerless to control other parts of the brain, which govern the associations. Hence the pictures created, which for the most part correspond to the objective impressions of the immediate past, combine with one another in a wild and uncontrolled fashion. As the number of brain cells set free constantly increases, the irrationality of the dream becomes constantly less. The conception of the dream as an incomplete, partial waking state, or traces of the influence of this conception, will of course be found in the works of all the modern psychologists and philosophers. It is most completely represented by Maury. It often seems as though this author conceives the state of being awake or asleep as susceptible of shifting from one anatomical region to another, each anatomical region seeming to him to be connected with a definite psychic function. Here I will merely suggest that even if the theory of partial waking were confirmed, its finer superstructure would still call for exhaustive consideration. No function of dreams, of course, can emerge from this conception of the dream life. On the contrary, Binz, one of the chief proponents of this theory, consistently enough denies that dreams have any status or importance. He says, page 357, "All the facts, as we see them, urge us to characterize the dreams as a physical process, in all cases useless, and in many cases definitely morbid." The expression physical in reference to dreams, the word is emphasized by the author, points, of course, in more than one direction. In the first place, it refers to the etiology of dreams, which was of special interest to Binz, as he was studying the experimental production of dreams by the administration of drugs. It is certainly in keeping with this kind of dream theory to ascribe the incitement to dreaming, whenever possible, exclusively to somatic origins. Presented in the most extreme form, the theory is as follows. After we have put ourselves to sleep by the banishment of stimuli, there would be no need to dream and no reason for dreaming until the morning, when the gradual awakening through the fresh invasion of stimuli might be reflected in the phenomenon of dreaming. But, as a matter of fact, it is not possible to protect our sleep from stimuli. Like the germs of life which Mephistopheles complained, stimuli come to the sleeper from all directions, from without, from within, and even from all those bodily regions which never trouble us during the waking state. Thus our sleep is disturbed, now this, now that little corner of the psyche is jogged into the waking state, and the psyche functions for a while with the awakened fraction, yet is thankful to fall asleep again. The dream is the reaction to the disturbance of sleep caused by the stimulus, but it is, when all is said, a purely superfluous reaction. The description of the dream, which after all remains an activity of the psychic organ, as a physical process, has yet another connotation. So to describe it is to deny that the dream has the dignity of a psychic process. The old simile of the 10 fingers of a person ignorant of music running over the keyboard of an instrument perhaps best illustrates in what esteem the dream is commonly held by the representatives of exact science. Thus conceived, it becomes something wholly insusceptible of interpretation. How could the 10 fingers of a player ignorant of music perform a musical composition? The theory of partial wakefulness did not escape criticism even by the earlier writers. Thus Burdick wrote in 1830, "If we say that dreaming is a partial waking, then, in the first place, neither the waking nor the sleeping state is explained thereby. Secondly, this amounts only to saying that certain powers of the mind are active in dreams, while others are at rest. But such irregularities occur throughout life." Page 482. The prevailing dream theory, which conceives the dream as a physical process, finds a certain support in a very interesting conception of the dream, which was first propounded by Robert in 1866, and which is seductive because it assigns to the dream a function or a useful result. As the basis of his theory, Robert takes 2 objectively observable facts, which we have already discussed in our consideration of dream material, Chapter 1b. These facts are: 1. That one very often dreams about the most insignificant impressions of the day, and 2. That one rarely carries over into the dream the absorbing interests of the day. Robert asserts as an indisputable fact that those matters which have been fully settled and solved never evoke dreams, but only such as lie incompleted in the mind, or touch it merely in passing, page 10. For this reason we cannot usually explain our dreams, since their causes are to be found in sensory impressions of the preceding day which have not attained sufficient recognition on the part of the dreamer. The condition permitting an impression to reach the dream is, therefore, that this impression has been disturbed in its elaboration, or that it was too insignificant to lay claim to such elaboration. Robert, therefore, conceives the dream as a physical process of elimination, which in its psychic reaction reaches the consciousness. Dreams are eliminations of thoughts, nipped in the bud. A man deprived of the capacity for dreaming would in time become mentally unbalanced, because an immense number of unfinished and unsolved thoughts and superficial impressions would accumulate in his brain, under the pressure of which all that should be incorporated in the memory as a completed whole would be stifled. The dream acts as a safety valve for the overburdened brain. Dreams possess a healing and unburdening power, page 32. We should misunderstand Robert if we were to ask him how representation in the dream could bring about an unburdening of the mind. The writer apparently concluded from these 2 peculiarities of the dream material that during sleep such an elimination of worthless impressions is effected somehow as a somatic process, and that dreaming is not a special psychic process, but only the information which we receive of such elimination. Moreover, elimination is not the only thing that takes place in the mind during sleep. Robert himself adds that the stimuli of the day are likewise elaborated, and what cannot be eliminated from the undigested thought material lying in the mind is bound up into a completed whole by mental clues borrowed from the imagination, and is thus enrolled in the memory as a harmless fantasy picture. Page 23. But it is in his criticism of the sources of dreams that Robert is most flatly opposed to the prevailing theory. Whereas, according to this theory, there would be no dream if the external and internal sensory stimuli did not repeatedly wake the mind. According to Robert, the impulse to dream lies in the mind itself. It lies in the overloading of the mind, which demands discharge, and Robert considers, quite consistently, that those causes conditioning the dream which depend on the physical condition assume a subordinate rank, and could not incite dreams in a mind which contained no material for dream formation derived from the waking consciousness. It is admitted, however, that the fantasy images originating in the depths of the mind may be influenced by nervous stimuli, page 48. Thus, according to Robert, dreams are not, after all, wholly dependent on the somatic element. Dreaming is, of course, not a psychic process, and it has no place among the psychic processes of the waking state. It is a nocturnal somatic process in the apparatus of mental activity, and has a function to perform, namely, to guard this apparatus against excessive strain, or, if we may be allowed to change the comparison, to cleanse the mind. Another author, Yves Delage, bases his theory on the same characteristics of the dream characteristics which are perceptible in the selection of the dream material, and it is instructive to observe how a trifling twist in the conception of the same things gives a final result entirely different in its bearings. Delage, having lost through death a person very dear to him, found that we either do not dream at all of what occupies us intently during the day, or that we begin to dream of it only after it is overshadowed by the other interests of the day. His investigations in respect of other persons corroborated the universality of this state of affairs. Concerning the dreams of newly married people, he makes a comment which is admirable if it should prove to be generally true. S'ils ont été fortement épris, presque jamais ils n'ont rêvé l'un de l'autre avant le mariage ou pendant la lune de miel. Et s'ils ont rêvé d'amour, c'est pour être infidèles avec quelque personne indifférente ou odieuse. But of what does one dream? Delage recognizes that the material of our dreams consists of fragments and remnants of impressions, both from the last few days and from earlier periods. All that appears in our dreams, all that we may at first be inclined to consider the creation of dream life, proves, on closer investigation, to be unrecognized reproduction, souvenir inconscient. But this representative material reveals one common characteristic. It originates from impressions which have probably affected our senses more forcibly than our mind, or from which the attention has been deflected soon after their occurrence. The less conscious, and at the same time the stronger an impression, the greater the prospect of its playing a part in our next dream. If they are very much in love, they have almost never dreamed of each other before the marriage or during the honeymoon, and if they have dreamed of love, it was to be unfaithful with someone unimportant or distasteful. These two categories of impressions, the insignificant and the undisposed of, are essentially the same as those which were emphasized by Robert, but Delage gives them another significance, inasmuch as he believes that these impressions are capable of exciting dreams not because they are indifferent, but because they are not disposed of. The insignificant impressions also are, in a sense, not fully disposed of. They, too, owing to their character of new impressions, are autant de ressorts tendus, which will be relaxed during sleep. Still more entitled to a role in the dream than a weak and almost unnoticed impression is a vivid impression which has been accidentally retarded in its elaboration, or unintentionally repressed. The psychic energy accumulated during the day by inhibition or suppression becomes the mainspring of the dream at night. In dreams, psychically suppressed material achieves expression. So many taut lines. 2. A novelist, Anatole France, expresses himself to a similar effect, le lys rouge. Ce que nous voyons la nuit, ce sont les restes malheureux que nous avons négligés pendant la veille. Le rêve est souvent la revanche des choses qu'on méprise ou que le reproche des autres abandonne. What we see at night are the unhappy relics that we neglected while awake. The dream is often the revenge of things scorned, or the reproach of beings deserted. Unfortunately, Delage does not pursue this line of thought any further. He is able to ascribe only the most insignificant role in our dreams to an independent psychic activity, and thus, in his theory of dreams, he reverts to the prevailing doctrine of a partial slumber of the brain. En somme, le rêve est le produit de la pensée errante, sans but et sans direction, se fixant successivement sur les souvenirs qui ont gardé assez d'intensité pour se placer sur sa route, et l'arrêter au passage, établissant entre eux un lien tantôt faible et indécis, tantôt plus fort et plus serré, selon que l'activité actuelle du cerveau est plus ou moins abolie par le sommeil. In short, the dream is the product of wandering thought, without end or direction, successively fixing on memories which have retained sufficient intensity to put themselves in the way and block the passage, establishing between themselves a connection sometimes weak and loose, sometimes stronger and closer, according to whether the actual work of the brain is more or less suppressed by sleep. 3. In a third group, we may include those dream theories which ascribe to the dreaming mind the capacity for and propensity to special psychic activities, which in the waking state it is able to exert either not at all or imperfectly. In most cases, the manifestation of these activities is held to result in a useful function of dreams. The evaluations of dreams by the earlier psychologists fall chiefly within this category. I shall content myself, however, with quoting in their stead the assertion of Burdick to the effect that dreaming is the natural activity of the mind, which is not limited by the power of the individuality, nor disturbed by self-consciousness, nor directed by self-determination, but is the vitality of the sensible focus indulging in free play. Page 486. Burdick and others evidently consider this reveling in the free use of its own powers as a state in which the mind refreshes itself and gathers fresh strength for the day's work, something indeed after the fashion of a vacation. Burdick therefore cites with approval the admirable words in which the poet Novalis lauds the power of the dream. The dream is a bulwark against the regularity and commonplace character of life, a free recreation of the fettered fantasy, in which it intermingles all the images of life and interrupts the constant seriousness of the adult by the joyful play of the child. Without the dream, we should surely grow old earlier, so that the dream may be considered, if not precisely as a gift from above, yet as a delightful exercise, a friendly companion on our pilgrimage to the grave. The refreshing and healing activity of dreams is even more impressively described by Purkinje, page 456. The productive dreams, in particular, would perform these functions. They are the unconstrained play of the imagination, and have no connection with the events of the day. The mind is loath to continue the tension of the waking life, but wishes to relax it and recuperate from it. It creates, in the first place, conditions opposed to those of the waking state. It cures sadness by joy, worry by hope, and cheerfully distracting images, hatred by love, and friendliness and fear by courage and confidence. It appeases doubt by conviction and firm belief, and vain expectation by realization. Sleep heals many sore spots in the mind, which the day keeps continually open, by covering them and guarding them against fresh irritation. On this depends, in some degree, the consoling action of time. We all feel that sleep is beneficial to the psychic life, and the vague surmise of the popular consciousness is apparently loath to surrender the notion that dreaming is one of the ways in which sleep bestows its benefits. The most original and most comprehensive attempt to explain dreaming as a special activity of the mind, which can freely unfold itself only in the sleeping state, is that made by Scherner in 1861. Scherner's book is written in a heavy and bombastic style, and is inspired by an almost intoxicated enthusiasm for the subject, which is bound to repel us unless it can carry us away with it. It places so many difficulties in the way of an analysis that we gladly resort to the clearer and conciser presentation of Scherner's theories made by the philosopher Foucault. From these mystical conglomerations, from all these outbursts of splendor and radiance, there indeed flashes and shines an ominous semblance of meaning, but the path of the philosopher is not illumined thereby. Such is the criticism of Scherner's exposition by one of his own followers. Scherner is not one of those writers for whom the mind carries its undiminished faculties into the dream life. He even explains how, in our dreams, the centrality and spontaneous energy of the ego become enervated, how cognition, feeling, will, and imagination are transformed by this decentralization, how the remnant of these psychic forces has not a truly intellectual character, but is rather of the nature of a mechanism. But, on the other hand, that activity of the psyche which may be described as fantasy, freed from all rational governance and hence no longer strictly controlled, rises to absolute supremacy in our dreams. To be sure, it borrows all its building material from the memory of the waking state. But with this material, it builds up structures which differ from those of the waking state, as day differs from night. In our dreams, it reveals itself as not only reproductive, but also productive. Its peculiarities give the dream life its singular character. It shows a preference for the unlimited, the exaggerated, the prodigious, but by its liberation from the inhibiting categories of thought, it gains a greater flexibility and agility, and indulges in pleasurable turns. It is excessively sensitive to the delicate emotional stimuli of the mind, to its stirring and disturbing effects, and it rapidly recasts the inner life into an external plastic visibility. The dream fantasy lacks the language of concepts. What it wishes to say, it must express in visible form, and since in this case the concept does not exert an inhibitory control, it depicts it in all the fullness, power, and breadth of visible form. But hereby its language, plain though it is, becomes cumbersome, awkward, and prolix. Plain speaking is rendered especially difficult by the fact that it dislikes expressing an object by its actual image, but prefers to select an alien image, if only the latter is able to express that particular aspect of the object which it is anxious to represent. Such is the symbolizing activity of the fantasy. It is, moreover, very significant that the dream fantasy reproduces objects not in detail, but only in outline, and in the freest possible manner. Its paintings, therefore, are like light and brilliant sketches. The dream fantasy, however, does not stop at the mere representation of the object, but feels an internal urge to implicate the dream ego to some extent with the object, and thus to give rise to action. The visual dream, for example, depicts gold coins lying in the street. The dreamer picks them up, rejoices, and carries them away. According to Schörner, the material upon which the dream fantasy exerts its artistic activity consists preponderantly of the organic sensory stimuli, which are so obscure during the day. Compare page 151 above. Hence it is that the over-fantastic theory of Schörner, and perhaps two matter-of-fact theories of Wundt and other psychologists, though otherwise diametrically opposed to each other, are in perfect agreement in their assumptions with regard to dream sources and dream stimuli. But whereas, according to the psychological theory, the psychic reaction to the inner physical stimuli becomes exhausted with the arousing of any of the ideas appropriate to these stimuli, as these ideas then, by way of association, call to their aid other ideas, so that on reaching this stage the chain of psychic processes appears to terminate. According to Schörner, on the other hand, the physical stimuli merely supply the psyche with material which it may utilize in fulfilling its fantastic intentions. For Schörner, dream formation begins where, according to the views of other writers, it comes to an end. What the dream fantasy does with the physical stimuli cannot, of course, be regarded as purposeful. The fantasy plays a tantalizing game with them, and represents the organic source of the stimuli of the dream in question by any sort of plastic symbolism. Indeed, Schörner holds, though here Foucault and others differ from him, that the dream fantasy has a certain favorite symbol for the organism as a whole, namely the house. Fortunately, however, for its representations, it does not seem to limit itself to this material. It may also employ a whole series of houses to designate a single organ. For example, very long streets of houses for the intestinal stimulus. In other dreams, particular parts of the house may actually represent particular regions of the body, as in the headache dream, when the ceiling of the room, which the dream sees covered with disgusting toad-like spiders, represents the head. Quite apart from the symbol of the house, Any other suitable object may be employed to represent those parts of the body which excite the dream. Thus, the breathing lungs find their symbol in the flaming stove with its windy roaring, the heart in the hollow chests and baskets, the bladder in round, ball-shaped or simply hollow objects. The man's dreams, when due to the sexual stimulus, make the dreamer find in the street the upper portion of a clarinet, or the mouthpiece of a tobacco pipe, or again a piece of fur. The clarinet and tobacco pipe represent the approximate form of the male's sexual organ, while the fur represents the pubic hair. In the sexual dreams of the female, the tightness of the closed thighs may be symbolized by a narrow courtyard surrounded by houses, and the vagina by a very narrow, slippery, and soft footpath leading through the courtyard, upon which the dreamer is obliged to walk, in order perhaps to carry a letter to a man. Folkelt, page 39. It is particularly noteworthy that at the end of such a physically stimulated dream, the fantasy, as it were, unmasks itself by representing the exciting organ or its function unconcealed. Thus, the tooth-excited dream usually ends with the dreamer taking a tooth out of his mouth. The dream fantasy may, however, direct its attention not merely to the form of the exciting organ, but may even make the substance contained therein the subject of symbolization. Thus, for example, the dream excited by the intestinal stimuli may lead us through muddy streets, the dream due to stimuli from the bladder to foaming water, or the stimulus as such, the nature of its excitation, and the object which it covets, are represented symbolically, or again, the dream ego enters into a concrete association with the symbolization of its own state, as, for example, when, in the case of painful stimuli, we struggle desperately with vicious dogs or raging bulls, or when, in a sexual dream, the dreamer sees herself pursued by a naked man. Disregarding all the possible prolixity of elaboration, a fantastic symbolizing activity remains as the central force of every dream. Folkelt, in his fine and enthusiastic essay, attempted to penetrate still further into the character of this fantasy, and to assign to the psychic activity, thus recognized, its position in a system of philosophical ideas, which, however, remains altogether too difficult of comprehension for anyone who is not prepared by previous training for the intuitive comprehension of philosophical modes of thought. Schörner attributes no useful function to the activity of the symbolizing fantasy in dreams. In dreams, the psyche plays with the stimuli which are offered to it. One might conjecture that it plays in a mischievous fashion, and we might be asked whether our detailed consideration of Schörner's dream theory, the arbitrariness of which and its deviation from the rules of all forms of research are only too obvious, can lead to any useful results. We might fitly reply that to reject Schörner's theory without previous examination would be imposing too arrogant a veto. This theory is based on the impressions produced by his dreams on a man who paid close attention to them, and who would appear to be personally very well equipped for tracing obscure psychic phenomena. Furthermore, it treats of a subject which, though rich in its contents and relations, has for thousands of years appeared mysterious to humanity, and to the elucidation of which science, strictly so called, has, as it confesses, contributed nothing beyond attempting, in uncompromising opposition to popular sentiment, to deny its content and significance. Finally, let us frankly admit that it seems as though we cannot very well avoid the fantastical in our attempts to explain dreams. We must remember also that there is such a thing as a fantasy of ganglion cells. The passage cited, page 87, from a sober and exact investigator like Binns, who describes how the dawn of awakening floods the dormant cell masses of the cerebral cortex, is not a whit less fanciful and improbable than Schörner's attempts at interpretation. I hope to be able to demonstrate that there is something real underlying these attempts, though the phenomena which he describes have been only vaguely recognized, and do not possess the character of universality that should entitle them to be the basis of a theory of dreams. For the present, Schörner's theory of dreams, in contrast to the medical theory, may perhaps lead us to realize between what extremes the explanation of dream life is still unsteadily vacillating. End of section 8. Reading by Malone.
Section 9 of The Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Westra. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud, translated by A. Brill. Chapter 1, Section H. The relation between dreams and mental diseases. When we speak of the relation of dreams to mental derangement, we may mean three different things. 1. Etiological and clinical relations, as when a dream represents or initiates a psychotic condition, or occurs subsequently to such a condition. 2. Changes which the dream life undergoes in cases of mental disease. 3. Inner relations between dreams and psychoses, analogies which point to an intimate relationship. These manifold relations between the two series of phenomena were in the early days of medical science, and are once more at the present time, a favorite theme of medical writers, as we may learn from the literature on the subject collated by Spitta, Redestock, Maury, and Tissy. Recently, Sante de Sanctis has directed his attention to this relationship. For the purposes of our discussion, it will suffice merely to glance at this important subject. As to the clinical and etiological relations between dreams and the psychoses, I will report the following observations as examples. Honbaum asserts that the first attack of insanity is frequently connected with a terrifying anxiety dream, and that the predominating idea is related to this dream. Sante de Sanctis adduces similar observations in respect of paranoiacs, and declares them to be, in some of them, le vraie cause déterminante de la folie, translated, the real determining cause of the madness. The psychosis may come to life quite suddenly, simultaneously with the dream that contains its effective and delusional explanation. Or it may develop slowly through subsequent dreams that have still to struggle against doubt. In one of de Sanctis's cases, an intensively moving dream was accompanied by slight hysterical attacks, which in their turn were followed by an anxious, melancholic state. Fair refers to a dream which was followed by hysterical paralysis. Here the dream is presented as the etiology of mental derangement, although we should be making a statement equally consistent with the facts were we to say that the first manifestation of the mental derangement occurred in the dream life, that the disorder first broke through in the dream. In other instances, the morbid symptoms are included in the dream life, or the psychosis remains confined to the dream life. Thus, Thomayer calls our attention to anxiety dreams, which must be conceived as the equivalent of epileptic attacks. Allison has described cases of nocturnal insanity, in which the subjects are apparently perfectly well in the daytime, while hallucinations, fits of frenzy, and the like regularly make their appearance at night. De Sanctis and Tissy record similar observations, the equivalent of a paranoid dream in an alcoholic, voices accusing a wife of infidelity. Tissy records many observations of recent date in which behavior of a pathological character, based on delusory hypotheses, obsessive impulses, had their origin in dreams. Ghislaine describes a case in which sleep was replaced by an intermittent insanity. We cannot doubt that one day the physician will concern himself not only with the psychology, but also with the psychopathology of dreams. In cases of convalescence from insanity, it is often especially obvious that while the functions may be healthy by day, the dream life may still partake of the psychosis. Gregory is said to have been the first to call attention to such cases. Macario gives an account of a maniac who, a week after his complete recovery, once more experienced in dreams the flux of ideas and the unbridled impulses of his disease. Concerning the changes which the dream life undergoes in chronic psychotics, little research has been undertaken as yet. On the other hand, early attention was given to the inner relationship between dreams and mental disturbances, a relationship which is demonstrated by the complete agreement of the manifestations occurring in each. According to Maury, Cabanis, in his Rapport du physique et du moral, was the first to call attention to this relationship. He was followed by Lelut, G. Moreau, and more particularly the philosopher Maine de Biran. The comparison between the two is, of course, older still. Redistock begins the chapter in which he deals with the subject by citing a number of opinions which insist on the analogy between insanity and dreaming. Kant says somewhere, "The lunatic is a dreamer in the waking state." According to Krauss, insanity is a dream in which the senses are awake. Schopenhauer terms the dream a brief insanity and insanity a long dream. Hagen describes delirium as a dream life which is induced not by sleep but by disease. Wundt, in his Physiologische Psychologie, declares, "As a matter of fact, we ourselves may in dreams experience almost all the manifestations which we observe in the asylums for the insane." The specific points of agreement, in consequence of which such a comparison commends itself to our judgment, are enumerated by Spitta, who groups them, very much as Maury has done, as follows. 1. Suspension, or at least retardation of self-consciousness, and consequently ignorance of the condition as such, the impossibility of astonishment, and a lack of moral consciousness. 2. Modified perception of the sensory organs. That is, perception is, as a rule, diminished in dreams and greatly enhanced in insanity. 3. Mutual combination of ideas, exclusively in accordance with the laws of association and reproduction, hence automatic series formations. Hence again the lack of proportion in the relations between ideas, exaggerations, phantasms. And the result of all this? 4. Changes in, for example, inversions of the personality and sometimes of the idiosyncrasies of the character, perversities. Redistock adds a few additional data concerning the analogous nature of the material of dreams and of mental derangement. The greatest number of hallucinations and illusions are found in the sphere of the senses of sight and hearing and general sensation. As in dreams, the fewest elements are supplied by the senses of smell and taste. The fever patient, like the dreamer, is assailed by reminiscences from the remote past. What the waking and healthy man seems to have forgotten is recollected in sleep and in disease. The analogy between dreams and the psychoses receives its full value only when, like a family resemblance, it is extended to the subtler points of mimicry and even the individual peculiarities of facial expression. To him who is tortured by physical and mental sufferings, the dream accords what has been denied him by reality, to wit, physical well-being and happiness. So too the insane see radiant images of happiness, eminence, and wealth. the supposed possession of estates and the imaginary fulfillment of wishes, the denial or destruction of which have actually been a psychic cause of the insanity, often form the main content of the delirium. The woman who has lost a dearly beloved child experiences in her delirium the joys of maternity. The man who has suffered reverses of fortune deems himself immensely wealthy, and the jilted girl sees herself tenderly beloved. The passage from Rudstock is an abstract of a brilliant exposition of Greisinger's, which reveals with the greatest clarity wish fulfillment as a characteristic of the imagination common to dreams and to the psychoses. My own investigations have taught me that here is to be found the key to a psychological theory of dreams and of the psychoses. Absurd combinations of ideas and weakness of judgment are the main characteristics of the dream and of insanity. The overestimation of one's own mental capacity, which appears absurd to sober judgment, is found alike in both, and the rapid flux of imaginings in the dream corresponds to the flux of ideas in the psychoses. Both are devoid of any measure of time. The splitting of the personality in dreams, which, for instance, distributes one's own knowledge between two persons, one of whom, the strange person, corrects one's own ego in the dream, entirely corresponds with the well-known splitting of the personality in hallucinatory paranoia. The dreamer, too, hears his own thoughts expressed by strange voices. Even the constant delusive ideas find their analogy in the stereotyped and recurring pathological dream. After recovering from delirium, patients not infrequently declare that the whole period of their illness appeared to them like an uncomfortable dream. Indeed, they inform us that sometimes during their illness they have suspected that they were only dreaming, just as often happens in the sleep dream. In view of all this, it is not surprising that Rudstock should summarize his own opinion and that of many others in the following words: "Insanity, an abnormal, morbid phenomenon, is to be regarded as an enhancement of the periodically recurring normal dream state." Krauss attempted to base the relationship between the dream and insanity upon their etiology, or rather upon the sources of excitation, thus perhaps making the relationship even more intimate than was possible on the basis of the analogous nature of the phenomena manifested. According to him, the fundamental element common to both is, as we've already learned, the organically conditioned sensation, the sensation of physical stimuli, the general sensation arising out of contributions from all the organs. The undeniable agreement between dreams and mental derangement, extending even to characteristic details, constitutes one of the strongest confirmations of the medical theory of dream life, according to which the dream is represented as a useless and disturbing process, and as the expression of a diminished psychic activity. One cannot expect, for the present, to derive the final explanation of the dream from the psychic derangements, since, as is well known, our understanding of the origin of the latter is still highly unsatisfactory. It is very probable, however, that a modified conception of the dream must also influence our views regarding the inner mechanism of mental disorders, and hence we may say that we are working towards the explanation of the psychoses when we endeavor to elucidate the mystery of dreams. Addendum 1909. I shall have to justify myself for not extending my summary of the literature of dream problems to cover the period between the first appearance of this book and the publication of the second edition. This justification may not seem very satisfactory to the reader. Nonetheless, to me it was decisive. The motives which induced me to summarize the treatment of dreams in the literature of the subject have been exhausted by the foregoing introduction. To have continued this would have cost me a great deal of effort and would not have been particularly useful or instructive. For the interval in question, a period of 9 years, has yielded nothing new or valuable as regards the conception of dreams, either in actual material or in novel points of view. In most of the literature which has appeared since the publication of my own work, the latter has not been mentioned or discussed. It has, of course, received the least attention from the so-called research workers on dreams, who have thus afforded a brilliant example of the aversion to learning anything new so characteristic of the scientist. Les savants ne sont pas curieux. Translated, the learned are not inquisitive, said the scoffer Anatole France. If there were such a thing in science as the right of revenge, I, in my turn, should be justified in ignoring the literature which has appeared since the publication of this book. The few reviews which have appeared in the scientific journals are so full of misconceptions and lack of comprehension that my only possible answer to my critics would be a request that they should read this book over again, or perhaps merely that they should read it. In the works of those physicians who make use of the psychoanalytic method of treatment, a great many dreams have been recorded and interpreted in accordance with my directions. Insofar as these works go beyond the confirmation of my own assertions, I have noted their results in the context of my exposition. A supplementary bibliography at the end of this volume comprises the most important of these new publications. The comprehensive work on the dream by Sante de Sanctis, of which a German translation appeared soon after its publication, was produced simultaneously with my own, so that I could not review his results, nor could he comment upon mine. I am sorry to have to express the opinion that this laborious work is exceedingly poor in ideas, so poor that one could never divine from it the possibility of the problems which I have treated in these pages. I can think of only two publications which touch on my own treatment of the dream problems. A young philosopher, H. Svoboda, who has ventured to extend W. Fleiss's discovery of biological periodicity in series of 23 and 28 days to the psychic field, has produced an imaginative essay in which, among other things, he has used this key to solve the riddle of dreams. Such a solution, however, would be an inadequate estimate of the significance of dreams. The material content of dreams would be explained by the coincidence of all those memories which, on the night of the dream, complete one of these biological periods for the first or the nth time. A personal communication of the author's led me to assume that he himself no longer took this theory very seriously, but it seems that I was mistaken in this conclusion. I shall record in another place some observations made with reference to Svoboda's thesis, which did not, however, yield convincing results. It gave me far greater pleasure to find by chance, in an unexpected quarter, a conception of the dream which is in complete agreement with the essence of my own. The relevant dates preclude the possibility that this conception was influenced by reading my book. I must therefore hail this as the only demonstrable concurrence with the essentials of my theory of dreams to be found in the literature of the subject. The book, which contains the passage that I have in mind, was published in its second edition in 1910 by Linnaeus under the title Phantasien eines Realisten. Addendum 1914. The above apologia was written in 1909. Since then, the state of affairs has certainly undergone a change. My contribution to the interpretation of dreams is no longer ignored in the literature of the subject, but the new situation makes it even more impossible to continue the foregoing summary. The interpretation of dreams has evoked a whole series of new contentions and problems, which have been expounded by the authors in the most varied fashions. But I cannot discuss these works until I have developed the theories to which their authors have referred. Whatever has appeared to me as valuable in this recent literature, I have accordingly reviewed in the course of the following exposition. End of Chapter 1, Section H of the Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Westra. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. Brill. Chapter 1, Section H. Section 10 of The Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Westra. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud, translated by A. Brill. Section 10. The Method of Dream Interpretation. The epigraph on the title page of this volume indicates the tradition to which I prefer to ally myself in the conception of the dream. I am proposing to show that dreams are capable of interpretation, and any contributions to the solution of the problems which have already been discussed will emerge only as possible byproducts in the accomplishment of my special task. On the hypothesis that dreams are susceptible of interpretation, I at once find myself in disagreement with the prevailing doctrine of dreams. In fact, with all the theories of dreams, excepting only that of Scherner, for to interpret a dream is to specify its meaning, to replace it by something which takes its position in the concatenation of our psychic activities as a link of definite importance and value. But as we have seen, the scientific theories of the dream leave no room for a problem of dream interpretation, since, in the first place, according to these theories, dreaming is not a psychic activity at all, but a somatic process which makes itself known to the psychic apparatus by means of symbols. Lay opinion has always been opposed to these theories. It asserts its privilege of proceeding logically, and although it admits that dreams are incomprehensible and absurd, it cannot summon up the courage to deny that dreams have any significance. Led by a dim intuition, it seems rather to assume that dreams have a meaning, albeit a hidden one, that they are intended as a substitute for some other thought process, and that we have only to disclose this substitute correctly in order to discover the hidden meaning of the dream. The unscientific world, therefore, has always endeavored to interpret dreams, and by applying one or the other of two essential different methods. The first of these methods envisages the dream content as a whole, and seeks to replace it by another content which is intelligible and in certain respects analogous. This is symbolic dream interpretation, and of course it goes to pieces at the very outset in the case of those dreams which are not only unintelligible but confused. The construction which the biblical Joseph placed upon the dream of Pharaoh furnishes an example of this method. The 7 fat kine, after which came 7 lean ones that devoured the former, were a symbolic substitute for 7 years of famine in the land of Egypt, which according to the prediction were to consume all the surplus that 7 fruitful years had produced. Much of the artificial dreams contrived by the poets are intended for some such symbolic interpretation, for they reproduce the thought conceived by the poet in a guise not unlike the disguise which we are wont to find in our dreams. A demonstration of the manner in which one arrives at such a symbolic interpretation cannot, of course, be given. Success remains a matter of ingenious conjecture, of direct intuition, and for this reason, dream interpretation has naturally been elevated into an art which seems to depend upon extraordinary gifts. Aristotle expressed himself in this connection by saying that the best interpreter of dreams is he who can best grasp similarities. For dream pictures, like pictures in water, are disfigured by the motion of the water, so that he hits the target best who is able to recognize the true picture in the distorted one. The second of the two popular methods of dream interpretation entirely abandons such claims. It might be described as the cipher method, since it treats the dream as a kind of secret code in which every sign is translated into another sign of known meaning, according to an established key. For example, I've dreamt of a letter, and also of a funeral or the like. I consult a dream book, and I find that letter is to be translated by vexation, and funeral by engagement. It now remains to establish a connection, which I am again to assume as pertaining to the future, by means of the rigmarole which I have deciphered. An interesting variant of this cipher procedure, a variant in which its character of purely mechanical transference is to a certain extent corrected, is presented in the work on dream interpretation by Artemidorus of Daldis. Here, not only the dream content, but also the personality and social position of the dreamer are taken into consideration, so that the same dream content has a significance for the rich man, the married man, or the orator, which is different from that which applies to the poor man, the bachelor, or, let us say, the merchant. The essential point, then, in this procedure is that the work of interpretation is not applied to the entirety of the dream, but to each portion of the dream content severally, as though the dream were a conglomerate in which each fragment calls for special treatment. Incoherent and confused dreams are certainly those that have been responsible for the invention of the cipher method. The worthlessness of both these popular methods of interpretation does not admit of discussion. As regards the scientific treatment of the subject, the symbolic method is limited in its application and is not susceptible of a general exposition. In the cipher method, everything depends upon whether the key, the dream book, is reliable, and for that all guarantees are lacking, so that one might be tempted to grant the contention of the philosophers and psychiatrists and to dismiss the problem of dream interpretation as altogether fanciful. After the completion of my manuscript, a paper by Stumpf came to my notice, which agrees with my work in attempting to prove that the dream is full of meaning and capable of interpretation. But the interpretation is undertaken by means of an allegorizing symbolism, and there is no guarantee that the procedure is generally applicable. I have, however, come to think differently. I've been forced to perceive that here, once more, we have one of those not infrequent cases where an ancient and stubbornly retained popular belief seems to have come nearer to the truth of the matter than the opinion of modern science. I must insist that the dream actually does possess a meaning, and that a scientific method of dream interpretation is possible. I've arrived at my knowledge of this method in the following manner. For years, I have been occupied with the resolution of certain psychopathological structures, hysterical phobias, obsessional ideas, and the like, with therapeutic intentions. I've been so occupied, in fact, that ever since I heard the significant statement of Joseph Breuer to the effect that in these structures regarded as morbid symptoms, solution and treatment go hand in hand. Where it has been possible to trace a pathological idea back to those elements in the psychic life of the patient to which it owed its origin, this idea has crumbled away and the patient has been relieved of it. In view of the failure of our other therapeutic efforts, and in the face of the mysterious character of these pathological conditions, it seemed to me tempting, in spite of all the difficulties, to follow the method initiated by Breuer until a complete elucidation of the subject had been achieved. I shall have occasion elsewhere to give a detailed account of the form which the technique of this procedure has finally assumed, and of the results of my efforts. In the course of these psychoanalytic studies, I happened upon the question of dream interpretation. My patients, after I had pledged them to inform me of all the ideas and thoughts which occurred to them in connection with a given theme, related their dreams, and thus taught me that a dream may be interpolated in the psychic concatenation, which may be followed backwards from a pathological idea into the patient's memory. The next step was to treat the dream itself as a symptom, and to apply to it the method of interpretation which had been worked out for such symptoms. For this, a certain psychic preparation on the part of the patient is necessary. A twofold effort is made to stimulate his attentiveness in respect of his psychic perceptions and to eliminate the critical spirit in which he is ordinarily in the habit of viewing such thoughts as come to the surface. For the purpose of self-observation with concentrated attention, it is advantageous that the patient should take up a restful position and close his eyes. He must be explicitly instructed to renounce all criticism of the thought formations which he may perceive. He must also be told that the success of the psychoanalysis depends upon his noting and communicating everything that passes through his mind, and that he must not allow himself to suppress one idea because it seems to him unimportant or irrelevant to the subject, or another because it seems nonsensical. He must preserve an absolute impartiality in respect to his ideas, for if he is unsuccessful in finding the desired solution of the dream, the obsessional idea, or the like, it will be because he permits himself to be critical of them. I've noticed in the course of my psychoanalytic work that the psychological state of a man in an attitude of reflection is entirely different from that of a man who is observing his psychic processes. In reflection, there is a greater play of psychic activity than in the most attentive self-observation. This is shown even by the tense attitude and the wrinkled brow of the man in a state of reflection, as opposed to the mimic tranquility of the man observing himself. In both cases, there must be concentrated attention, but the reflective man makes use of his critical faculties, with the result that he rejects some of the thoughts which rise into consciousness after he has become aware of them, and abruptly interrupts others, so that he does not follow the lines of thought which they would otherwise open up for him, while in respect of yet other thoughts he is able to behave in such a manner that they do not become conscious at all, that is to say, they are suppressed before they are perceived. In self-observation, on the other hand, he has but one task, that of suppressing criticism. If he succeeds in doing this, an unlimited number of thoughts enter his consciousness which would otherwise have eluded his grasp. With the aid of the material thus obtained, material which is new to the self-observer, it is possible to achieve the interpretation of pathological ideas, and also that of dream formations. As will be seen, the point is to induce a psychic state which is in some degree analogous as regards the distribution of psychic energy, mobile attention, to the state of the mind before falling asleep, and also, of course, to the hypnotic state. On falling asleep, the undesired ideas emerge, owing to the slackening of a certain arbitrary and, of course, also critical action, which is allowed to influence the trend of our ideas. We are accustomed to speak of fatigue as the reason of this slackening. The emerging undesired ideas are changed into visual and auditory images in the condition which it utilized for the analysis of dreams and pathological ideas. This activity is purposely and deliberately renounced, and the psychic energy thus saved, or some part of it, is employed in attentively tracking the undesired thoughts which now come to the surface, thoughts which retain their identity as ideas, in which the condition differs from the state of falling asleep. Undesired ideas are thus changed into desired ones. There are many people who do not seem to find it easy to adopt the required attitude toward the apparently free-rising ideas, and to renounce the criticism which is otherwise applied to them. The undesired ideas habitually evoke the most violent resistance, which seems to prevent them from coming to the surface. But if we may credit our great poet-philosopher Friedrich Schiller, the essential condition of poetical creation includes a very similar attitude. In a certain passage in his correspondence with Körner, for the tracing of which we are indebted to Otto Rank, Schiller replies in the following words to a friend who complains of his lack of creative power. The reason for your complaint lies, it seems to me, in the constraint which your intellect imposes upon your imagination. Here I will make an observation, and illustrate it by an allegory. Apparently, it is not good, and indeed it hinders the creative work of the mind if the intellect examines too closely the ideas already pouring in, as it were, at the gates. Regarded in isolation, an idea may be quite insignificant and venturesome in the extreme, but it may acquire importance from an idea which follows it. Perhaps in a certain collocation with other ideas, which may seem equally absurd, it may be capable of furnishing a very serviceable link. The intellect cannot judge all these ideas unless it can retain them until it has considered them in connection with these other ideas. In the case of a creative mind, it seems to me the intellect has withdrawn its watchers from the gates, and the ideas rush in pell-mell, and only then does it review and inspect the multitude. You worthy critics, or whatever you may call yourselves, are ashamed or afraid of the momentary and passing madness which is found in all real creators, the longer or shorter duration of which distinguishes the thinking artist from the dreamer. Hence your complaints of unfruitfulness, for you reject too soon and discriminate too severely. And yet, such a withdrawal of the watchers from the gates of the intellect, as Schiller puts it, such a translation into the condition of uncritical self-observation is by no means difficult. Most of my patients accomplish it after my first instructions. I myself can do so very completely if I assist the process by writing down the ideas that flash through my mind. The quantum of psychic energy, by which the critical activity is thus reduced, and by which the intensity of self-observation may be increased, varies considerably according to the subject matter upon which the attention is to be fixed. The first step in the application of this procedure teaches us that one cannot make the dream as a whole the object of one's attention, but only the individual components of its content. If I ask a patient who is as yet unpracticed, "What occurs to you in connection with this dream?" he is unable, as a rule, to fix upon anything in his psychic field of vision. I must first dissect the dream for him. Then, in connection with each fragment, he gives me a number of ideas which may be described as the thoughts behind this part of the dream. In this first and important condition, then, the method of dream interpretation which I employ diverges from the popular, historical, and legendary method of interpretation by symbolism and approaches more nearly to the second, or cipher method. Like this, it is an interpretation in detail, not en masse. Like this, it conceives the dream from the outset as something built up, as a conglomerate of psychic formations. In the course of my psychoanalysis of neurotics, I've already subjected perhaps more than 1,000 dreams to interpretation, but I do not wish to use this material now as an introduction to the theory and technique of dream interpretation, for quite apart from the fact that I should lay myself open to the objection that these are the dreams of neuropaths, so that the conclusions drawn from them would not apply to the dreams of healthy persons, there's another reason that impels me to reject them. The theme to which these dreams point is, of course, always the history of the malady that is responsible for the neurosis. Hence, every dream would require a very long introduction and an investigation of the nature and the etiological conditions of the psychoneuroses, matters which are in themselves novel and exceedingly strange, and which would therefore distract attention from the dream problem proper. My purpose is rather to prepare the way, by the solution of the dream problem, for the solution of the more difficult problems of the psychology of the neuroses. But if I eliminate the dreams of neurotics, which constitute my principal material, I cannot be too fastidious in my treatment of the rest. Only those dreams are left which have been incidentally related to me by healthy persons of my acquaintance, or which I find given as examples in the literature of dream life. Unfortunately, in all these dreams, I am deprived of the analysis without which I cannot find the meaning of the dream. My mode of procedure is, of course, less easy than that of the popular cipher method, which translates the given dream content by reference to an established key. I, on the contrary, hold that the same dream content may conceal a different meaning in the case of different persons, or in different connections. I must therefore resort to my own dreams as a source of abundant and convenient material, furnished by a person who is more or less normal, and containing references to many incidents of everyday life. I shall certainly be confronted with doubts as to the trustworthiness of these self-analyses, and it will be said that arbitrariness is by no means excluded in such analyses. In my own judgment, Conditions are more likely to be favorable in self-observation than in the observations of others. In any case, it is permissible to investigate how much can be accomplished in the matter of dream interpretation by means of self-analysis. There are other difficulties which must be overcome in my own inner self. One has a comprehensible aversion to exposing so many intimate details of one's own psychic life, and one does not feel secure against the misinterpretations of strangers. But one must be able to transcend such considerations. Tout psychologiste, writes Delboeuf, every psychologist is obliged to admit even his own weaknesses, if he thinks by that he may throw his light on a difficult problem. And I may assume for the reader that his initial interest in the indiscretions which I must commit will very soon give way to an exclusive engrossment in the psychological problems elucidated by them. I shall therefore select one of my own dreams for the purpose of elucidating my method of interpretation. Every such dream necessitates a preliminary statement, so that I must now beg the reader to make my interests his own for a time, and to become absorbed with me in the most trifling details of my life. For an interest in the hidden significance of dreams imperatively demands just such a transference. End of recording. End of section 10. Recording by Matthew Westra for LibriVox. Section 11 of The Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Westra. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. Brill. Section 11. Preliminary statement. In the summer of 1895, I had treated psychoanalytically a young lady who was an intimate friend of mine and of my family. It will be understood that such complicated relations may excite manifold feelings in the physician, and especially the psychotherapist. The personal interest of the physician is greater, but his authority less. If he fails, his friendship with the patient's relatives is in danger of being undermined. In this case, however, the treatment ended in partial success. The patient was cured of her hysterical anxiety, but not all of her somatic symptoms. At that time, I was not yet quite sure of the criteria which denote the final cure of an hysterical case, and I expected her to accept a solution which did not seem acceptable to her. In the midst of this disagreement, we discontinued the treatment for the summer holidays. One day, a younger colleague, one of my most intimate friends, who had visited the patient, Irma, and her family in their country residence, called upon me. I asked him how Irma was, and received the reply, "She is better, but not quite well." I realized that these words of my friend Otto's, or the tone of voice in which they were spoken, annoyed me. I thought I heard a reproach in the words, perhaps to the effect that I had promised the patient too much, and rightly or wrongly, I attributed Otto's apparent taking sides against me to the influence of the patient's relatives, who I assumed had never approved of my treatment. This disagreeable impression, however, did not become clear to me, nor did I speak of it. That same evening I wrote the clinical history of Irma's case in order to give it, as though to justify myself, to Dr. M., a mutual friend, who was at that time the leading personality in our circle. During the night, or rather in the early morning, I had the following dream, which I recorded immediately after waking. Dream of July 23 to 24, 1895. A great hall, a number of guests whom we are receiving, among them Irma, whom I immediately take aside as though to answer her letter and reproach her for not yet accepting the solution. I say to her, "If you still have pains, it is really only your own fault." She answers, "If you only knew what pains I have now in the throat, stomach, and abdomen. I am choked by them." I'm startled. I look at her. She looks pale and puffy. I think that after all I must be overlooking some organic affection. I take her to the window and look into her throat. She offers some resistance to this, like a woman who has a set of false teeth. I think surely she doesn't need them. The mouth then opens wide, and I find a large white spot on the right, and elsewhere I see extensive grayish-white scabs adhering to curiously curled formations, which are evidently shaped like the turbinal bones of the nose. I quickly call Dr. M., who repeats the examination and confirms it. Dr. M. looks quite unlike his usual self. He is very pale, he limps, and his chin is clean-shaven. Now my friend Otto, too, is standing beside her, and my friend Leopold percusses her covered chest and says, "She has a dullness below, on the left," and also calls attention to an infiltrated portion of skin on the left shoulder, which I can feel in spite of the dress. M. says, "There's no doubt that it's an infection, but it doesn't matter. Dysentery will follow, and the poison will be eliminated." We know, too, precisely how the infection originated. My friend Otto, not long ago, gave her, when she was feeling unwell, an injection of a preparation of propyl's propionic acid, trimethylamine, a formula of which I see before me printed in heavy type. One doesn't give such injections so rashly. Probably, too, the syringe was not clean. This dream has an advantage over many others. It is at once obvious to what ends of the preceding day it is related, and of what subject it treats. The preliminary statement explains these matters. The news of Irma's health, which I had received from Otto, and the clinical history, which I was writing late into the night, had occupied my psychic activities even during sleep. Nevertheless, no one who had read the preliminary report and had knowledge of the content of the dream could guess what the dream signified, nor do I myself know. I am puzzled by the morbid symptoms of which Irma complains in the dream, for they are not the symptoms for which I treated her. I smile at the nonsensical idea of an injection of propionic acid and at Dr. M.'s attempt at consolation. Towards the end of the dream seems more obscure and quicker in tempo than at the beginning. In order to learn the significance of all these details, I resolve to undertake an exhaustive analysis. Analysis. The hall, a number of guests whom we are receiving. We were living that summer at Bellevue, an isolated house on one of the hills adjoining the Kahlenberg. This house was originally built as a place of entertainment, and therefore has unusually lofty hall-like rooms. The dream was dreamed in Bellevue, a few days before my wife's birthday. During the day, my wife had mentioned that she expected several friends, and among them Irma, to come to us as guests for her birthday. My dream then anticipates this situation. It is my wife's birthday, and we are receiving a number of people, among them Irma, as guests in the large hall of Bellevue. I reproach Irma for not having accepted the solution. I say, "If you still have pains, it is really your own fault." I might even have said this while awake. I may have actually said it. At that time, I was of the opinion, recognized later to be incorrect, that my task was limited to informing patients of the hidden meaning of their symptoms. Whether they then accepted or did not accept the solution upon which success depended, for that I was not responsible. I'm grateful to this error, which fortunately has now been overcome, since it made life easier for me at a time when, with all my unavoidable ignorance, I was expected to effect successful cures. But I note that, in the speech which I make to Irma in the dream, I am above all anxious that I shall not be blamed for the pains which she still suffers. If it is Irma's own fault, it cannot be mine. Should the purpose of the dream be looked for in this quarter? Irma's complaints: pains in the neck, abdomen, and stomach. She is choked by them. Pains in the stomach belonged to the symptom complex of my patient, but they were not very prominent. She complained rather of qualms and a feeling of nausea. Pains in the neck and abdomen and constriction of the throat played hardly any part in her case. I wonder why I have decided upon this choice of symptoms in the dream. For the moment, I cannot discover the reason. She looks pale and puffy. My patient had always a rosy complexion. I suspect that here another person is being substituted for her. I am startled at the idea that I may have overlooked some organic affection. This, as the reader will readily believe, is a constant fear with the specialist who sees neurotics almost exclusively and who is accustomed to ascribe to hysteria so many manifestations which other physicians treat as organic. On the other hand, I am haunted by a faint doubt. I do not know whence it comes, whether my alarm is altogether honest. If Irma's pains are indeed of organic origin, it is not my duty to cure them. My treatment, of course, removes only hysterical pains. It seems to me, in fact, that I wish to find an error in the diagnosis, for then I could not be reproached with failure to effect a cure. I take her to the window in order to look into her throat. She resists a little, like a woman who has false teeth. I think to myself, she does not need them. I had never had occasion to inspect Irma's oral cavity. The incident in the dream reminds me of an examination made some time before of a governess who at first produced an impression of youthful beauty, but who, upon opening her mouth, took certain measures to conceal her denture. Other memories of medical examinations and of petty secrets revealed by them, to the embarrassment of both physician and patient, associate themselves with this case. Surely she does not need them, is perhaps in the first place a compliment to Irma, but I suspect yet another meaning. In a careful analysis, one is able to feel whether or not the ariae penses, which are to be expected, have all been exhausted. The way in which Irma stands at the window suddenly reminds me of another experience. Irma has an intimate woman friend of whom I think very highly. One evening, on paying her a visit, I found her at the window, in the position reproduced in the dream, and her physician, the same Dr. M., declared that she had a diphtheritic membrane. The person of Dr. M. and the membrane return, indeed, in the course of the dream. Now it occurs to me that during the past few months I have had every reason to suppose that this lady, too, is hysterical. Yes, Irma herself betrayed the fact to me. But what do I know of her condition? Only the one thing, that, like Irma in the dream, she suffers from hysterical choking. Thus, in the dream, I have replaced my patient by her friend. Now I remember that I have often played with the supposition that this lady, too, might ask me to relieve her of her symptoms. But even at the time I thought it improbable, since she is extremely reserved. She resists, as the dream shows. Another explanation might be that she does not need it. In fact, until now, she has shown herself strong enough to master her condition without outside help. Now only a few features remain, which I can assign neither to Irma nor to her friend: pale, puffy, false teeth. The false teeth led me to the governess. I now feel inclined to be satisfied with bad teeth. Here another person, to whom these features may allude, occurs to me. She is not my patient, and I do not wish her to be my patient, for I have noticed that she is not at her ease with me, and I do not consider her a docile patient. She is generally pale, and once, when she had not felt particularly well, she was puffy. I have thus compared my patient Irma with two others, who would likewise resist treatment. What is the meaning of the fact that I have exchanged her for her friend in the dream? Perhaps that I wish to exchange her. Either her friend arouses in me stronger sympathies, or I have a higher regard for her intelligence, for I consider Irma foolish because she does not accept my solution. The other woman would be more sensible, and would thus be more likely to yield. The mouth then opens readily. She would tell more than Irma. I suspect that the interpretation of this portion has not been carried far enough to follow every hidden meaning. If I were to continue the comparison of the three women, I should go far afield. Every dream has at least one point at which it is unfathomable, a central point, as it were, connecting it with the unknown. What I see in the throat: a white spot and scabby terminal bones. The white spot recalls diphtheria, and thus Irma's friend, but it also recalls the grave illness of my eldest daughter 2 years earlier, and all the anxiety of that unhappy time. The scab on the terminal bones reminds me of my anxiety concerning my own health. At that time, I frequently used cocaine in order to suppress distressing swellings in the nose, and I had heard a few days previously that a lady patient who did likewise had contracted an extensive necrosis of the nasal mucous membrane. In 1885, it was I who had recommended the use of cocaine, and I had been gravely reproached in consequence. A dear friend who had died before the date of this dream had hastened his end by the misuse of this remedy. I quickly called Dr. M., who repeats the examination. This would simply correspond to the position which M. occupied among us. But the word quickly is striking enough to demand a special examination. It reminds me of a sad medical experience. By continually prescribing a drug, sulfonal, which at that time was still considered harmless, I was once responsible for a condition of acute poisoning in the case of a woman patient, and hastily turned for assistance to my older and more experienced colleague. The fact that I really had this case in mind is confirmed by a subsidiary circumstance. The patient, who succumbed to the toxic effects of the drug, bore the same name as my eldest daughter. I had never thought of this until now, but now it seems to me almost like a retribution of fate, as though the substitution of persons had to be continued in another sense. This Matilda for that Matilda, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It is as though I were seeking every opportunity to reproach myself for a lack of medical conscientiousness. Dr. M. is pale, his chin is shaven, and he limps. Of this, so much is correct. That is, his unhealthy appearance often arouses the concerns of his friends. The other two characteristics must belong to another person. An elder brother living abroad occurs to me, for he, too, shaves his chin, and if I remember him rightly, the M of the dream bears, on the whole, a certain resemblance to him. And some days previously, the news arrived that he was limping on account of an arthritic affection of the hip. There must be some reason why I fused the two persons into one in my dream. I remember that, in fact, I was on bad terms with both of them for similar reasons. Both had rejected a certain proposal which I had recently made them. My friend Otto is now standing next to the patient, and my friend Leopold examines her and calls attention to a dullness low down on the left side. My friend Leopold also is a physician, and a relative of Otto's. Since the two practice the same specialty, fate has made them competitors, so that they are constantly being compared with one another. Both of them assisted me for years, while I was still directing a public clinic for neurotic children. There, scenes like that reproduced in my dream had often taken place. While I would be discussing the diagnosis of a case with Otto, Leopold would examine the child anew and make an unexpected contribution towards our decision. There was a difference of character between the two men, like that between Inspector Brasig and his friend Karl. Otto was remarkably prompt and alert. Leopold was slow and thoughtful, but thorough. If I contrast Otto and the cautious Leopold in the dream, I do so apparently in order to extol Leopold. The comparison is like that made above between the disobedient patient Irma and her friend, who is believed to be more sensible. I now become aware of one of the tracks along which the association of ideas in the dream proceeds, from the sick child to the children's clinic. Concerning the dullness low on the left side, I have the impression that it corresponds with a certain case of which all the details were similar, a case in which Leopold impressed me by his thoroughness. I thought vaguely, too, of something like a metastatic affection, but it might also be a reference to the patient whom I should have liked to have in Irma's place, for this lady, as far as I can gather, exhibited symptoms which imitated tuberculosis. An infiltrated portion of skin on the left shoulder. I know at once that this is my own rheumatism of the shoulder, which I always feel if I lie awake long at night. The very phrasing of the dream sounds ambiguous. Something which I can feel, as he does, in spite of the dress. Feel on my own body is intended. Further, it occurs to me how unusual the phrase infiltrated portion of skin sounds. We are accustomed to the phrase, an infiltration of the upper posterior left. This would refer to the lungs, and thus, once more, to tuberculosis. In spite of the dress, this, to be sure, is only an interpolation. At the clinic, the children were, of course, examined undressed. Here we have some contrast to the manner in which adult female patients have to be examined. The story used to be told of an eminent physician that he always examined his patients through their clothes. The rest is obscure to me. I have, frankly, no inclination to follow the matter further. Dr. M says, it's an infection, but it doesn't matter. Dysentery will follow, and the poison will be eliminated. This at first seems to me ridiculous. Nevertheless, like everything else, it must be carefully analyzed. More closely observed, it seems, after all, to have a sort of meaning. What I had found in the patient was a local diphtheritis. I remember the discussion about diphtheritis and diphtheria at the time of my daughter's illness. Diphtheria is the general infection which proceeds from local diphtheritis. Leopold demonstrates the existence of such a general infection by the dullness, which also suggests a metastatic focus. I believe, however, that just this kind of metastasis does not occur in the case of diphtheria. It reminds me rather of pyema. It does matter is a consolation. I believe it fits in as follows. The last part of the dream has yielded a content to the effect that the patient's sufferings are the result of a serious organic affection. I begin to suspect that by this I am only trying to shift the blame from myself. Psychic treatment cannot be held responsible for the continued presence of a diphtheritic affection. Now indeed I am distressed by the thought of having invented such a serious illness for Irma for the sole purpose of exculpating myself. It seems so cruel. Accordingly, I need the assurance that the outcome will be benign, and it seems to me that I made a good choice when I put the words that consoled me into the mouth of Dr. M. But here I am placing myself in a position of superiority to the dream, a fact which needs explanation. But why is this consolation so nonsensical? Dysentery. Some sort of far-fetched theoretical notion that the toxins of disease might be eliminated through the intestines. Am I thereby trying to make fun of Dr. M.'s remarkable store of far-fetched explanations, his habit of conceiving curious pathological relations? Dysentery suggests something else. A few months ago, I had in my care a young man who was suffering from remarkable intestinal troubles, a case which had been treated by other colleagues as one of anemia and malnutrition. I realized that it was a case of hysteria. I was unwilling to use my psychotherapy on him and sent him off on a sea voyage. Now, a few days previously, I had received a despairing letter from him. He wrote from Egypt saying that he had had a fresh attack, which the doctor had declared to be dysentery. I suspect that the diagnosis is merely an error on the part of an ignorant colleague who is allowing himself to be fooled by the hysteria. Yet I cannot help reproaching myself for putting the invalid in a position where he might contract some organic affection of the bowels in addition to his hysteria. Furthermore, dysentery sounds not unlike diphtheria, a word which does not occur in the dream. Yes, it must be the case that with the consoling prognosis, dysentery will develop, etc. I am making fun of Dr. M., for I recollect that years ago he once jestingly told a very similar story of a colleague. He had been called in to consult with him in the case of a woman who was very seriously ill, and he felt obliged to confront his colleague, who seemed very hopeful, with the fact that he found albumin in the patient's urine. His colleague, however, did not allow this to worry him, but answered calmly, "That does not matter, my dear sir. The albumin will soon be excreted." Thus I can no longer doubt that this part of the dream expresses derision for those of my colleagues who are ignorant of hysteria, and as though in confirmation, the thought enters my mind. Does Dr. M. know that the appearances in Irma's friend, his patient, which give him reason to fear tuberculosis, are likewise due to hysteria? Has he recognized this hysteria, or has he allowed himself to be fooled? But what can be my motive in treating this friend so badly? That is simple enough. Dr. M. agrees with my solution as little as does Irma herself. Thus, in this dream, I have already revenged myself in 2 persons, on Irma in the words, If you still have pains, it is your own fault, and on Dr. M in the wording of the nonsensical consolation which has been put into his mouth. We know precisely how the infection originated. This precise knowledge in the dream is remarkable. Only a moment before this, we did not yet know of the infection, since it was first demonstrated by Leopold. My friend Otto gave her an injection not long ago, when she was feeling unwell. Otto had actually related during his short visit to Irma's family that he had been called in to a neighboring hotel in order to give an injection to someone who had been suddenly taken ill. Injections remind me once more of the unfortunate friend who poisoned himself with cocaine. I had recommended the remedy for internal use only during the withdrawal of morphia, but he immediately gave himself injections of cocaine. With a preparation of propyl's propionic acid. How on earth did this occur to me? On the evening of the day after I had written the clinical history and dreamed about the case, my wife opened a bottle of liqueur labeled Ananas, which was a present from our friend Otto. He had, as a matter of fact, a habit of making presents on every possible occasion. I hope he will someday be cured of this by a wife. This liqueur smelt so strongly of fusel oil that I refused to drink it. My wife suggested, "We will give the bottle to the servants," and I, more prudent, objected with the philanthropic remark, "They shan't be poisoned either." The smell of fusel oil, amyl, has now apparently awakened my memory of the whole series, propyl, methyl, etc., which furnished the preparation of propyl mentioned in the dream. Here, indeed, I have effected a substitution. I dreamt of propyl after smelling amyl, but substitutions of this kind are perhaps permissible, especially in organic chemistry. Trimethylamine. In the dream, I see the chemical formula of this substance, which at all events is evidence of a great effort on the part of my memory, and the formula is even printed in heavy type, as though to distinguish it from the context as something of particular importance. And where does trimethylamine, thus forced on my attention, lead me? To a conversation with another friend, who for years has been familiar with all my germinating ideas, and I with his. At that time, he had just informed me of certain ideas concerning asexual chemistry, and had mentioned, among others, that he thought he had found in trimethylamine one of the products of sexual metabolism. This substance thus leads me to sexuality, a factor to which I attribute the greatest significance in respect of the origin of these nervous affections which I am trying to cure. My patient Irma is a young widow. If I am required to excuse my failure to cure her, I shall perhaps do best to refer to this condition, which her admirers would be glad to terminate. But in what a singular fashion such a dream is fitted together! The friend who in my dream becomes my patient in Irma's place is likewise a young widow. I surmise why it is that the formula of trimethylamine is so insistent in the dream. So many important things are centered around this one word. Trimethylamine is an allusion not merely to the all-important factor of sexuality, but also to a friend whose sympathy I remember with satisfaction whenever I feel isolated in my opinions. And this friend, who plays such a large part in my life, will he not appear yet again in the concatenation of ideas peculiar to this dream? Of course, he has a special knowledge of the results of affections of the nose and the sinuses, and has revealed to science several highly remarkable relations between the turbinal bones and the female sexual organs, the three curly formations in Irma's throat. I got him to examine Irma in order to determine whether her gastric pains were of nasal origin, but he himself suffers from suppurative rhinitis, which gives me concern, and to this perhaps there is an allusion in pyemia, which hovers before me in the metastasis of the dream. One doesn't give such injections so rashly. Here the reproach of rashness is hurled directly at my friend Otto. I believe I had some such thought in the afternoon when he seemed to indicate, by word and look, that he had taken sides against me. It was perhaps how easily he is influenced, how irresponsibly he pronounces judgment. Further, the above sentence points once more to my deceased friend who so irresponsibly resorted to cocaine injections. As I have said, I had not intended that injections of the drug should be taken. I note that in reproaching Otto, I once more touch upon the story of the unfortunate Matilda, which was the pretext for the same reproach against me. Here, obviously, I am collecting examples of my conscientiousness and also of the reverse. Probably, too, the syringe was not clean. Another reproach directed at Otto, but originating elsewhere. On the previous day, I happened to meet the son of an old lady of 82, to whom I am obliged to give 2 injections of morphia daily. At present, she is in the country, and I have heard that she is suffering from phlebitis. I immediately thought that this might be a case of infiltration caused by a dirty syringe. It is my pride that in 2 years I have not given her a single infiltration. I am always careful, of course, to see that the syringe is perfectly clean, for I am conscientious. From the phlebitis, I return to my wife, who once suffered from thrombosis during a period of pregnancy. And now 3 related situations come to the surface in my memory, involving my wife, Irma, and the dead Matilda, whose identity has apparently justified my putting these 3 persons in one another's places. I have now completed the interpretation of the dream. In the course of this interpretation, I have taken great pains to avoid all those notions which must have been suggested by a comparison of the dream content with the dream thoughts hidden behind this content. Meanwhile, the meaning of the dream has dawned upon me. I have noted an intention which is realized through the dream, and which must have been my motive in dreaming. The dream fulfills several wishes, which were awakened within me by the events of the previous evening, Otto's news, and the writing of the clinical history. For the result of the dream is that it is not I who am to blame for the pain which Irma is still suffering, but that Otto is to blame for it. Now Otto has annoyed me by his remark about Irma's imperfect cure. The dream avenges me upon him. In that, it turns the reproach upon himself. The dream acquits me of responsibility for Irma's condition, as it refers this condition to other causes, which do, indeed, furnish quite a number of explanations. The dream represents a certain state of affairs, such as I might wish to exist. The content of the dream is thus the fulfillment of a wish. Its motive is a wish. This much is apparent at first sight, but many other details of the dream become intelligible when regarded from the standpoint of wish fulfillment. I take my revenge on Otto, not merely for too readily taking sides against me, in that I accuse him of careless medical treatment, the injection, but I revenge myself also for the bad liqueur which smells of fusel oil, and I find an expression in the dream which unites both these reproaches, the injection of a preparation of propyl. Still I am not satisfied, but continue to avenge myself by comparing him with his more reliable colleague. Thereby I seem to say, I like him better than you. But Otto is not the only person who must be made to feel the weight of my anger. I take my revenge on the disobedient patient by exchanging her for a more sensible and more docile one. Nor do I pass over Dr. M.'s contradiction, for I express, in an obvious allusion, my opinion of him, namely, that his attitude in this case is that of an ignoramus, dysentery will develop, etc. Indeed, it seems as though I were appealing from him to someone better informed, my friend who told me about trimethylamine, just as I have turned from Irma to her friend, and from Otto to Leopold. It is as though I were to say, rid me of these 3 persons, replace them by 3 others of my own choice, and I shall be rid of the reproaches which I am not willing to admit that I deserve. In my dream, the unreasonableness of these reproaches is demonstrated for me in the most elaborate manner. Irma's pains are not attributable to me, since she herself is to blame for them, in that she refuses to accept my solution. They do not concern me, for being as they are of an organic nature, they cannot possibly be cured by psychic treatment. Irma's sufferings are satisfactorily explained by her widowhood, trimethylamine, a state which I cannot alter. Irma's illness has been caused by an incautious injection administered by Otto, an injection of an unsuitable drug, such as I should never have administered. Irma's complaint is the result of an injection made with an unclean syringe, like the phlebitis of my old lady patient, whereas my injections have never caused any ill effects. I am aware that these explanations of Irma's illness, which unite in acquitting me, do not agree with one another, that they even exclude one another. The whole plea for this dream is nothing else. Recalls vividly the defense offered by a man who was accused by his neighbor of having returned a kettle in a damaged condition. In the first place, he had returned the kettle undamaged. In the second place, it already had holes in it when he borrowed it. And in the third place, he had never borrowed it at all. The complicated defense, but so much the better. If only one of these three lines of defense is recognized as valid, the man must be acquitted. Still other themes play a part in the dream, and their relation to my non-responsibility for Irma's illness is not so apparent. My daughter's illness, and that of a patient with the same name, the harmfulness of cocaine, the affection of my patient who was traveling in Egypt, concern about the health of my wife, my brother, and Dr. M., my own physical troubles, and anxiety concerning my absent friend, who is suffering from suppurative rhinitis. But if I keep all these things in view, they combine into a single train of thought, which might be labeled concern for the health of myself and others, professional conscientiousness. I recall a vaguely disagreeable feeling when Otto gave me the news of Irma's condition. Lastly, I am inclined, after the event, to find an expression of this fleeting sensation in the train of thoughts which forms part of the dream. It is as though Otto had said to me, "You do not take your medical duties seriously enough. You are not conscientious. You do not perform what you promise." Thereupon this train of thought placed itself at my service, in order that I might give proof of my extreme conscientiousness, of my intimate concern about the health of my relatives, friends, and patients. Curiously enough, there are also some painful memories in this material, which confirm the blame attached to Otto, rather than my own exculpation. The material is apparently impartial, but the connection between this broader material, on which the dream is based, and the more limited theme from which emerges the wish to be innocent of Irma's illness, is nevertheless unmistakable. I do not wish to assert that I have entirely revealed the meaning of the dream, or that my interpretation is flawless. I could still spend much time upon it. I could draw further explanations from it and discuss further problems which it seems to propound. I can even perceive the points from which further mental associations might be traced. But such considerations, as are always involved in every dream of one's own, prevent me from interpreting it farther. Those who are over ready to condemn such reserve should make the experiment of trying to be more straightforward. For the present, I am content with the one fresh discovery which has just been made. If the method of dream interpretation here indicated is followed, it will be found that dreams do really possess a meaning, and are by no means the expression of a disintegrated cerebral activity, as the writers on the subject would have us believe. When the work of interpretation has been completed, the dream can be recognized as a wish fulfillment. End of recording. End of section 11. Recording by Matthew Westra.
Section 12 of The Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Moyer. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. Brill. Section 12. The Dream as Wish Fulfillment. When, after passing through a narrow defile, one suddenly reaches a height beyond which the ways part, and a rich prospect lies outspread in different directions, it is well to stop for a moment and consider whither one shall turn next. We are in somewhat the same position after we have mastered this first interpretation of a dream. We find ourselves standing in the light of a sudden discovery. The dream is not comparable to the irregular sounds of a musical instrument which, instead of being played by the hand of a musician, is struck by some external force. The dream is not meaningless, not absurd, does not presuppose that one part of our store of ideas is dormant while another part begins to awake. It is a perfectly valid psychic phenomenon, actually a wish fulfillment. It may be enrolled in the continuity of the intelligible psychic activities of the waking state. It is built up by a highly complicated intellectual activity. But at the very moment when we are about to rejoice in this discovery, a host of problems besets us. If the dream, as this theory defines it, represents a fulfilled wish, what is the cause of the striking and unfamiliar manner in which this fulfillment is expressed? What transformation has occurred in our dream thoughts before the manifest dream, as we remember it on waking, shapes itself out of them? How has this transformation taken place? Whence comes the material that is worked up into the dream? What causes many of the peculiarities which are to be observed in our dream thoughts? For example, how is it that they are able to contradict one another? Is the dream capable of teaching us something new concerning our internal psychic processes, and can its content correct opinions which we have held during the day? I suggest that for the present all these problems be laid aside, and that a single path be pursued. We have found that the dream represents a wish as fulfilled. Our next purpose should be to ascertain whether this is a general characteristic of dreams, or whether it is only the accidental content of the particular dream, the dream about Irma's injection, with which we have begun our analysis. For even if we conclude that every dream has a meaning and psychic value, we must nevertheless allow for the possibility that this meaning may not be the same in every dream. The first dream which we have considered was the fulfillment of a wish. Another may turn out to be the realization of an apprehension. A third may have a reflection as its content. A fourth may simply reproduce a reminiscence. Are there, then, dreams other than wish dreams, or are there none but wish dreams? It is easy to show that the wish fulfillment in dreams is often undisguised and easy to recognize, so that one may wonder why the language of dreams has not long since been understood. There is, for example, a dream which I can evoke as often as I please, experimentally as it were. If, in the evening, I eat anchovies, olives, or other strongly salted foods, I am thirsty at night, and therefore I wake. The waking, however, is preceded by a dream which has always the same content, namely, that I am drinking. I am drinking long draughts of water. It tastes as delicious as only a cool drink can taste when one's throat is parched. And then I wake and find that I have an actual desire to drink. The cause of this dream is thirst, which I perceive when I wake. From this sensation arises the wish to drink, and the dream shows me this wish as fulfilled. It thereby serves a function, the nature of which I soon surmise. I sleep well, and am not accustomed to being waked by a bodily need. If I succeed in appeasing my thirst by means of the dream that I am drinking, I need not wake up in order to satisfy that thirst. It is thus a dream of convenience. The dream takes the place of action, as elsewhere in life. Unfortunately, the need of water to quench the thirst cannot be satisfied by a dream, as can my thirst for revenge upon Otto and Dr. M., but the intention is the same. Not long ago, I had the same dream in a somewhat modified form. On this occasion, I felt thirsty before going to bed, and emptied the glass of water which stood on the little chest beside my bed. Some hours later, during the night, my thirst returned, with the consequent discomfort. In order to obtain water, I should have had to get up and fetch the glass which stood on my wife's bed table. I thus, quite appropriately, dreamt that my wife was giving me a drink from a vase. This vase was an Etruscan cinerary urn, which I had brought home from Italy, and had since given away. But the water in it tasted so salt, apparently on account of the ashes, that I was forced to wake. It may be observed how conveniently the dream is capable of arranging matters. Since the fulfillment of a wish is its only purpose, it may be perfectly egoistic. Love of comfort is really not compatible with consideration for others. The introduction of the cinerary urn is probably once again the fulfillment of a wish. I regret that I no longer possess this vase. It, like the glass of water at my wife's side, is inaccessible to me. The cinerary urn is appropriate also in connection with the sensation of an increasingly salty taste, which I know will compel me to wake. Such convenience dreams came very frequently to me in my youth. Accustomed as I had always been to working until late at night, early waking was always a matter of difficulty. I used then to dream that I was out of bed and standing at the washstand. After a while, I could no longer shut out the knowledge that I was not yet up, but in the meantime I had continued to sleep. The same sort of lethargy dream was dreamed by a young colleague of mine, who appears to share my propensity for sleep. With him it assumed a particularly amusing form. The landlady with whom he was lodging in the neighborhood of the hospital had strict orders to wake him every morning at a given hour, but she found it by no means easy to carry out his orders. One morning, sleep was especially sweet to him. The woman called into his room, "Herr Pepi, get up, you've got to go to the hospital." Whereupon the sleeper dreamt of a room in the hospital, of a bed in which he was lying, and of a chart pinned over his head, which read as follows: Pepi M., medical student, 22 years of age. He told himself in the dream, "If I am already at the hospital, I don't have to go there," turned over, and slept on. He had thus frankly admitted to himself his motive for dreaming. Here is yet another dream of which the stimulus was active during sleep. One of my women patients, who had been obliged to undergo an unsuccessful operation on the jaw, was instructed by her physicians to wear by day and night a cooling apparatus on the affected cheek. But she was in the habit of throwing it off as soon as she had fallen asleep. One day I was asked to reprove her for doing so. She had again thrown the apparatus on the floor. The patient defended herself as follows. This time I really couldn't help it. It was the result of a dream which I had during the night. In the dream, I was in a box at the opera and was taking a lively interest in the performance. But Herr Karl Meyer was lying in the sanatorium and complaining pitifully on account of pains in his jaw. I said to myself, since I haven't the pains, I don't need the apparatus either. That's why I threw it away. The dream of this poor sufferer reminds me of an expression which comes to our lips when we are in a disagreeable situation. Well, I can imagine more amusing things. The dream presents these more amusing things. Herr Karl Meyer, to whom the dreamer attributed her pains, was the most casual acquaintance of whom she could think. It is quite as simple a matter to discover the wish fulfillment in several other dreams which I have collected from healthy persons. A friend who was acquainted with my theory of dreams and had explained it to his wife, said to me one day, "My wife asked me to tell you that she dreamt yesterday that she was having her menses. You will know what that means." Of course I know. If the young wife dreams that she is having her menses, the menses have stopped. I can well imagine that she would have liked to enjoy her freedom a little longer before the discomforts of maternity began. It was a clever way of giving notice of her first pregnancy. Another friend writes that his wife had dreamt not long ago that she noticed milk stains on the front of her blouse. This also is an indication of pregnancy, but not of the first one. The young mother hoped she would have more nourishment for the second child than she had for the first. A young woman who for weeks had been cut off from all society because she was nursing a child who was suffering from an infectious disease, dreamt, after the child had recovered, of a company of people in which Alphonse Daudet, Paul Bourget, Marcel Prévost, and others were present. They were all very pleasant to her and amused her enormously. In her dream, these different authors had the features which their portraits give them. Monsieur Prévost, with whose portrait she is not familiar, looked like the man who had disinfected the sick room the day before, the first outsider to enter it for a long time. Obviously, the dream is to be translated thus: "It is about time now for something more entertaining than this eternal nursing." Perhaps this collection will suffice to prove that frequently, and under the most complex conditions, dreams may be noted which can be understood only as wish fulfillments, and which present their content without concealment. In most cases, these are short and simple dreams, and they stand in pleasant contrast to the confused and overloaded dream compositions which have almost exclusively attracted the attention of the writers on the subject. But it will repay us if we give some time to the examination of these simple dreams. the simplest dreams of all are, I suppose, to be expected in the case of children, whose psychic activities are certainly less complicated than those of adults. Child psychology, in my opinion, is destined to render the same services to the psychology of adults as a study of the structure or development of the lower animals renders to the investigation of the structure of the higher orders of animals. Hitherto, but few deliberate efforts have been made to make use of the psychology of the child for such a purpose. The dreams of little children are often simple fulfillments of wishes, and for this reason are, as compared with the dreams of adults, by no means interesting. They present no problem to be solved, but they are invaluable as affording proof that the dream, in its inmost essence, is the fulfillment of a wish. I have been able to collect several examples of such dreams from the material furnished by my own children. For 2 dreams, one that of a daughter of mine, at that time 8½ years of age, and the other that of a boy of 5 1/4, I am indebted to an excursion to Hallstatt in the summer of 1806. I must first explain that we were living that summer on a hill near Aussee, from which, when the weather was fine, we enjoyed a splendid view of the Dachstein. With a telescope we could easily distinguish the Simony hut. The children often tried to see it through the telescope, I do not know with what success. Before the excursion, I had told the children that Hallstatt lay at the foot of the Dachstein. They looked forward to the outing with the greatest delight. From Hallstatt we entered the valley of Eschern, which enchanted the children with its constantly changing scenery. One of them, however, the boy of 5, gradually became discontented. As often as a mountain came into view, he would ask, "Is that the Dachstein?" Whereupon I had to reply, "No, only a foothill." After this question had been repeated several times, he fell quite silent, and did not wish to accompany us up the steps leading to the waterfall. I thought he was tired, but the next morning he came to me perfectly happy, and said, "Last night I dreamt that we went to the Simony hut." I understood him now. He had expected, when I spoke of the Dachstein, that on our excursion to Hallstatt he would climb the mountain and would see at close quarters the hut which had been so often mentioned when the telescope was used. When he learned that he was expected to content himself with foothills and a waterfall, he was disappointed and became discontented. But the dream compensated him for all this. I tried to learn some details of the dream. They were scanty. You go up steps for 6 hours, as he had been told. On this excursion, the girl of 8 1/2 had likewise cherished wishes which had to be satisfied by a dream. We had taken with us to Hallstatt our neighbor's 12-year-old boy, quite a polished little gentleman, who, it seemed to me, had already won the little woman's sympathies. Next morning she related the following dream. "Just think, I dreamt that Emil was one of the family, that he said Papa and Mama to you, and slept at our house in the big room like one of the boys. Then Mama came into the room and threw a handful of big bars of chocolate wrapped in blue and green paper under our beds." The girl's brothers, who evidently had not inherited an understanding of dream interpretation, declared, just as the writers we have quoted would have done, "That dream is nonsense." The girl defended at least one part of the dream, and from the standpoint of the theory of the neuroses, it is interesting to learn which part it was that she defended. That Emile was one of the family was nonsense, but that about the bars of chocolate wasn't. It was just this latter part that was obscure to me until my wife furnished the explanation. On the way home from the railway station, the children had stopped in front of a slot machine and had wanted exactly such bars of chocolate, wrapped in paper with a metallic luster, such as the machine, in their experience, provided. But the mother thought, and rightly so, that the day had brought them enough wish fulfillments, and therefore left this wish to be satisfied in the dream. This little scene had escaped me. That portion of the dream which had been condemned by my daughter I understood without any difficulty. I myself had heard the well-behaved little guest enjoining the children, as they were walking ahead of us, to wait until Papa or Mamma had come up. For the little girl, the dream turned this temporary relationship into a permanent adoption. Her affection could not as yet conceive of any other way of enjoying her friend's company permanently than the adoption pictured in her dream, which was suggested by her brothers. Why the bars of chocolate were thrown under the bed could not, of course, be explained without questioning the child. From a friend I have learned of a dream very much like that of my little boy. It was dreamed by a little girl of 8. Her father, accompanied by several children, had started on a walk to Dornbach with the intention of visiting the Rohrer hut, but had turned back as it was growing late, promising the children to take them some other time. On the way back they passed a signpost which pointed to the hameau. The children now asked him to take them to the hameau, but once more, and for the same reason, they had to be content with the promise that they should go there some other day. Next morning, the little girl went to her father and told him, with a satisfied air, "Papa, I dreamed last night that you were with us at the Rohrer hut and on the hameau." Thus, in the dream, her impatience had anticipated the fulfillment of the promise made by her father. Another dream, with which the picturesque beauty of the Aussee inspired my daughter, at that time 3¼ years of age, is equally straightforward. The little girl had crossed the lake for the first time, and the trip had passed too quickly for her. She did not want to leave the boat at the landing, and cried bitterly. The next morning she told us, "Last night I was sailing on the lake." Let us hope that the duration of this dream voyage was more satisfactory to her. My eldest boy, at that time 8 years of age, was already dreaming of the realization of his fancies. He had ridden in a chariot with Achilles, with Diomedes as charioteer. On the previous day he had shown a lively interest in a book on the myths of Greece, which had been given to his elder sister. If it can be admitted that the talking of children in their sleep belongs to the sphere of dreams, I can relate the following as one of the earliest dreams in my collection. My youngest daughter, at that time 19 months old, vomited one morning, and was therefore kept without food all day. During the night she was heard to call excitedly in her sleep, "Anna, Freud, strawberry, wild strawberry, omelette, pop." She used her name in this way in order to express the act of appropriation. The menu presumably included everything that would seem to her a desirable meal. The fact that 2 varieties of strawberry appeared in it was demonstration against the sanitary regulations of the household, and was based on the circumstance, which she had by no means overlooked, that the nurse had ascribed her indisposition to an over-plentiful consumption of strawberries. So, in her dream, she avenged herself for this opinion which met with her disapproval. When we call childhood happy because it does not yet know sexual desire, we must not forget what a fruitful source of disappointment and renunciation, and therefore of dream stimulation, the other great vital impulse may be for the child. Here is a second example. My nephew, 22 months of age, had been instructed to congratulate me on my birthday and to give me a present of a small basket of cherries, which at that time of the year were scarce, being hardly in season. He seemed to find the task a difficult one, for he repeated again and again, "Cherries in it," and could not be induced to let the little basket go out of his hands. But he knew how to indemnify himself. He had, until then, been in the habit of telling his mother every morning that he had dreamt of the white soldier, an officer of the guard in a white cloak, whom he had once admired in the street. On the day after the sacrifice on my birthday, he woke up joyfully with the announcement, which could have referred only to a dream: "Hermann eaten all the cherries." What animals dream of, I do not know. A proverb for which I am indebted to one of my pupils professes to tell us, for it asks the question, "What does the goose dream of?" and answers, "Of maize." The whole theory that the dream is the fulfillment of a wish is contained in these two sentences. We now perceive that we should have reached our theory of the hidden meaning of dreams by the shortest route had we merely consulted the vernacular. Proverbial wisdom, it is true, often speaks contemptuously enough of dreams. It apparently seeks to justify the scientists when it says that dreams are bubbles. But in colloquial language, the dream is predominantly the gracious fulfiller of wishes. I should never have imagined that in my wildest dreams we exclaim in delight if we find that the reality surpasses our expectations. End of section 12.
Section 13 of the Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud, translated by A. A. Brill, Section 13. Distortion in Dreams. Preliminary Statement. If I now declare that wish fulfillment is the meaning of every dream, so that there cannot be any dreams other than wish dreams, I know beforehand that I shall meet with the most emphatic contradiction. My critics will object. The fact that there are dreams which are to be understood as fulfillments of wishes is not new, but has long since been recognized by such writers as Radistock, Volkelt, Purkinje, Grissinger, and others. That there can be no other dreams than those of wish fulfillments is yet one more unjustified generalization, which fortunately can be easily refuted. Dreams which present the most painful content, and not the least trace of wish fulfillment, occur frequently enough. The pessimistic philosopher, Edward von Hartmann, is perhaps most completely opposed to the theory of wish fulfillment. In his Philosophy of the Unconscious, Part 2, he says, "As regards the dream, with it all the troubles of waking life pass over into the sleeping state, all save the one thing which may in some degree reconcile the cultured person with life, scientific and artistic enjoyment." But even less pessimistic observers have emphasized the fact that in our dreams pain and disgust are more frequent than pleasure. Two ladies, Sarah Weed and Florence Hallam, have even worked out, on the basis of their dreams, a numerical value for the preponderance of distress and discomfort in dreams. They find that 58% of dreams are disagreeable, and only 28.6% positively pleasant. Besides those dreams that convey into our sleep the many painful emotions of life, there are also anxiety dreams, in which this most terrible of all the painful emotions torments us until we wake. Now it is precisely by these anxiety dreams that children are so often haunted. And yet it was in children that you found the wish-fulfillment dream in its most obvious form. Already Plotinus, the Neoplatonist, said, "When desire bestirs itself, then comes fantasy, and presents to us, as it were, the object of desire." The anxiety dream does really seem to preclude a generalization of the thesis deduced from the examples given in the last chapter, that dreams are wish fulfillments, and even to condemn it as an absurdity. Nevertheless, it is not difficult to parry these apparently invincible objections. It is merely necessary to observe that our doctrine is not based upon the estimates of the obvious dream content, but relates to the thought content, which in the course of interpretation is found to lie behind the dream. Let us compare and contrast the manifest and the latent dream content. It is true that there are dreams the manifest content of which is of the most painful nature. But has anyone ever tried to interpret these dreams to discover their latent thought content? If not, the two objections to our doctrine are no longer valid, for there is always the possibility that even our painful and terrifying dreams may, upon interpretation, prove to be wish fulfillments. It is quite incredible with what obstinacy readers and critics have excluded this consideration and disregarded the fundamental differentiation between the manifest and the latent dream content. Nothing in the literature of the subject approaches so closely to my own conception of dreams as a passage in J. Sully's essay, Dreams as a Revelation. It would seem then, after all, that dreams are not the utter nonsense they have been said to be by such authorities as Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Milton. The chaotic aggregations of our night fancy have a significance and communicate new knowledge. Like some letter in cipher, the dream inscription, when scrutinized, closely loses its first look of balderdash and takes on the aspect of a serious, intelligible message. Or, to vary the figure slightly, we may say that, like some palimpsest, the dream discloses beneath its worthless surface characters, traces of an old and precious communication. In scientific research, it is often advantageous, if the solution of one problem presents difficulties, to add it to a second problem, just as it is easier to crack two nuts together instead of separately. Thus, we are confronted not only with the problem, how can painful and terrifying dreams be the fulfillment of wishes, but we may add to this a second problem which arises from the foregoing discussion of the general problem of the dream. Why do not the dreams that show an indifferent content and yet turn out to be wish fulfillments reveal their meaning without disguise? Take the exhaustively treated dream of Irma's injection. It is by no means of a painful character, and it may be recognized upon interpretation as a striking wish fulfillment. But why is an interpretation necessary at all? Why does not the dream say directly what it means? As a matter of fact, the dream of Irma's injection does not at first produce the impression that it represents a wish of the dreamer's as fulfilled. The reader will not have received this impression, and even I myself was not aware of the fact until I had undertaken the analysis. If we call this peculiarity of dreams, namely, that they need elucidation, the phenomenon of distortion in dreams, a second question then arises. What is the origin of this distortion in dreams? If one's first thoughts on this subject were consulted, several possible solutions might suggest themselves. For example, that during sleep one is incapable of finding an adequate expression for one's dream thoughts. The analysis of certain dreams, however, compels us to offer another explanation. I shall demonstrate this by means of a second dream of my own, which again involves numerous indiscretions, but which compensates for this personal sacrifice by affording a thorough elucidation of the problem. Preliminary statement. In the spring of 1897, I learnt that two professors of our university had proposed me for the title of Professor Extraordinarius, assistant professor. The news came as a surprise to me, and pleased me considerably as an expression of appreciation on the part of two eminent men, which could not be explained by personal interest. But I told myself immediately that I must not expect anything to come of their proposal. For some years past, the ministry had disregarded such proposals, and several colleagues of mine, who were my seniors and at least my equals in desert, had been waiting in vain all this time for the appointment. I had no reason to suppose that I should fare any better. I resolved, therefore, to resign myself to disappointment. I am not, so far as I know, ambitious, and I was following my profession with gratifying success, even without the recommendation of a professorial title. Whether I considered the grapes to be sweet or sour did not matter, since they undoubtedly hung too high for me. One evening a friend of mine called to see me, one of those colleagues whose fate I had regarded as a warning. As he had long been a candidate for promotion to the professoriate, which in our society makes the doctor a demigod to his patients, and as he was less resigned than I, he was accustomed from time to time to remind the authorities of his claims in the hope of advancing his interests. It was after one of these visits that he called on me. He said that this time he had driven the exalted gentleman into a corner, and had asked him frankly whether considerations of religious denomination were not really responsible for the postponement of his appointment. The answer was, His Excellency had to admit that in the present state of public opinion he was not in a position, etc. Now at least I know where I stand, my friend concluded his narrative, which told me nothing new, but which was calculated to confirm me in resignation. For the same denominational considerations would apply to my own case. On the morning after my friend's visit I had the following dream, which was notable also on account of its form. It consisted of 2 thoughts and 2 images, so that a thought and an image emerged alternately. But here I shall record only the first half of the dream, since the second half has no relation to the purpose for which I cite the dream. 1. My friend R is my uncle. I have a great affection for him. 2. I see before me his face, somewhat altered. It seems to be elongated. A yellow beard which surrounds it is seen with peculiar distinctness. Then follow the other 2 portions of the dream, again a thought and an image, which I omit. The interpretation of this dream was arrived at in the following manner. When I recollected the dream in the course of the morning, I laughed outright and said, "The dream is nonsense." But I could not get it out of my mind, and I was pursued by it all day until at last, in the evening, I reproached myself in these words. If in the course of a dream interpretation one of your patients could find nothing better to say than, "That is nonsense," you would reprove him, and you would suspect that behind the dream there was hidden some disagreeable affair, the exposure of which he wanted to spare himself. Apply the same thing to your own case. Your opinion that the dream is nonsense probably signifies merely an inner resistance to its interpretation. Don't let yourself be put off. I then proceeded with the interpretation. R is my uncle. What can that mean? I had only one uncle, my Uncle Joseph. His story, to be sure, was a sad one. Once, more than 30 years ago, hoping to make money, he allowed himself to be involved in transactions of a kind which the law punishes severely, and paid the penalty. My father, whose hair turned gray with grief within a few days, used always to say that Uncle Joseph had never been a bad man, but, after all, he was a simpleton. If, then, my friend R is my Uncle Joseph, that is equivalent to saying R is a simpleton. Hardly credible, and very disagreeable. But there is the face that I saw in the dream, with its elongated features and its yellow beard. My uncle actually had such a face, long and framed in a handsome yellow beard. My friend R was extremely swarthy, but when black-haired people begin to grow gray, they pay for the glory of their youth. Their black beards undergo an unpleasant change of color, hair by hair. First, they turn a reddish-brown, then a yellowish-brown, and then definitely gray. My friend R's beard is now in this stage. So, for that matter, is my own, a fact which I note with regret. The face that I see in my dream is at once that of my friend R and that of my uncle. It is like one of those composite photographs of Galton's. In order to emphasize family resemblances, Galton had several faces photographed on the same plate. No doubt is now possible. It is really my opinion that my friend R is a simpleton, like my Uncle Joseph. It is astonishing to see how my memory here restricts itself, in the waking state, for the purposes of analysis. I have known 5 of my uncles, and I loved and honored one of them. But at the moment when I overcame my resistance to the interpretation of the dream, I said to myself, I have only one uncle, the one who was intended in the dream. I have still no idea for what purpose I have worked out this relationship. It is certainly one to which I must unreservedly object. Yet it is not very profound, for my uncle was a criminal, and my friend R is not, except insofar as he was once fined for knocking down an apprentice with his bicycle. Can I be thinking of this offense? That would make the comparison ridiculous. Here I recollect another conversation, which I had some days ago with another colleague, N. As a matter of fact, on the same subject. I met N in the street. He, too, has been nominated for a professorship, and having heard that I had been similarly honored, he congratulated me. I refused his congratulations, saying, "You are the last man to jest about the matter, for you know from your own experience what the nomination is worth." Thereupon he said, though probably not in earnest, "You can't be sure of that. There is a special objection in my case. Don't you know that a woman once brought a criminal accusation against me? I need hardly assure you that the matter was put right. It was a mean attempt at blackmail, and it was all I could do to save the plaintiff from punishment. But it may be that the affair is remembered against me at the ministry. You, on the other hand, are above reproach. Here, then, I have the criminal, and at the same time the interpretation and tendency of my dream." My Uncle Joseph represents both of my colleagues who have not been appointed to the professorship, the one as a simpleton, the other as a criminal. Now, too, I know for what purpose I need this representation. If denominational considerations are a determining factor in the postponement of my two friends' appointment, then my own appointment is likewise in jeopardy. But if I can refer the rejection of my two friends to other causes, which do not apply to my own case, my hopes are unaffected. This is the procedure followed by my dream. It makes the one friend R a simpleton and the other N a criminal. But since I am neither one nor the other, there is nothing in common between us. I have a right to enjoy my appointment to the title of professor, and have avoided the distressing application to my own case of the information which the official gave to my friend R. I must pursue the interpretation of this dream still farther, for I have a feeling that it is not yet satisfactorily elucidated. I still feel disquieted by the ease with which I have degraded two respected colleagues in order to clear my own way to the professorship. My dissatisfaction with this procedure has, of course, been mitigated since I have learned to estimate the testimony of dreams at its true value. I should contradict anyone who suggested that I really considered R a simpleton, or that I did not believe N's account of the blackmailing incident. And of course I do not believe that Irma has been made seriously ill by an injection of a preparation of propyl administered by Otto. Here, as before, what the dream expresses is only my wish that things might be so. The statement in which my wish is realized sounds less absurd in the second dream than in the first. It is here made with a skillful use of actual points of support in establishing something like a plausible slander, one of which could say that there is something in it. For at that time my friend R had to contend with the adverse vote of a university professor of his own department, and my friend N had himself, all unsuspectingly, provided me with material for the calumny. Nevertheless, I repeat, it still seems to me that the dream requires further elucidation. I remember now that the dream contained yet another portion which has hitherto been ignored by the interpretation. After it occurred to me that my friend R was my uncle, I felt in the dream a great affection for him. To whom is this feeling directed? For my Uncle Joseph, of course. I have never had any feelings of affection. R has for many years been a dearly loved friend. But if I were to go to him and express my affection for him in terms approaching the degree of affection which I felt in the dream, he would undoubtedly be surprised. My affection, if it was for him, seems false and exaggerated, as does my judgment of his intellectual qualities, which I express by merging his personality in that of my uncle, but exaggerated in the opposite direction. Now, however, a new state of affairs dawns upon me. The affection in the dream does not belong to the latent content, to the thoughts behind the dream. It stands in opposition to this content. It is calculated to conceal the knowledge conveyed by the interpretation. Probably this is precisely its function. I remember with what reluctance I undertook the interpretation, how long I tried to postpone it, and how I declared the dream to be sheer nonsense. I know from my psychoanalytic practice how such a condemnation is to be interpreted. It has no informative value, but merely expresses an effect. If my little daughter does not like an apple which is offered her, she asserts that the apple is bitter, without even tasting it. If my patient behaves thus, I know that we are dealing with an idea which they are trying to repress. The same thing applies to my dream. I do not want to interpret it because there is something in the interpretation to which I object. After the interpretation of the dream is completed, I discover what it was to which I objected. It was the assertion that R is a simpleton. I can refer the affection which I feel for R not to the latent dream thoughts, but rather to this unwillingness of mine. If my dream, as compared with its latent content, is disguised at this point, and actually misrepresents things by producing their opposites, then the manifest affection in the dream serves the purpose of the misrepresentation. In other words, the distortion is here shown to be intentional. It is a means of disguise. My dream thoughts of R are derogatory, and so that I may not become aware of this very opposite of defamation, a tender affection for him enters into the dream. This discovery may prove to be generally valid. As the examples in Chapter 3 have demonstrated, there are, of course, dreams which are undisguised wish fulfillments. Wherever a wish fulfillment is unrecognizable and disguised, there must be present a tendency to defend oneself against this wish, and in consequence of this defense, the wish is unable to express itself save in a distorted form. I will try to find a parallel in social life to this occurrence in the inner psychic life. Where in social life can a similar misrepresentation be found? Only where two persons are concerned, one of whom possesses a certain power, while the other has to act with a certain consideration on account of this power. The second person will then distort his psychic actions, or as we say, he will mask himself. The politeness which I practice every day is largely a disguise of this kind. If I interpret my dreams for the benefit of my readers, I am forced to make misrepresentations of this kind. The poet even complains of the necessity of such misrepresentation. Das Best, was du wissen kannst, darfst du den Buben doch nicht sagen. The best that thou canst know, thou mayst not tell to boys. The political writer who has unpleasant truths to tell those in power finds himself in a like position. If he tells everything without reserve, the government will suppress them, retrospectively in the case of verbal expression of opinion, preventively if they are to be published in the press. The writer stands in fear of the censorship. He therefore moderates and disguises the expression of his opinions. He finds himself compelled, in accordance with the sensibilities of the censor, either to refrain altogether from certain forms of attack, or to express himself in allusions instead of by direct assertions. He may, for instance, tell of a contretemps between two Chinese mandarins, while he really has in mind officials of his own country. The stricter the domination of the censorship, the more thorough becomes the disguise, and often enough, the more ingenious the means employed to put the reader on the track of the actual meaning. The detailed correspondence between the phenomena of censorship and the phenomena of dream distortion justifies us in presupposing similar conditions for both. We should then assume that in every human being there exists, as the primary cause of dream formation, two psychic forces, tendencies or systems, one of which forms the wish expressed by the dream, while the other exercises a censorship over the dream wish, thereby enforcing on it a distortion. The question is, what is the nature of the authority of this second agency, by virtue of which it is able to exercise its censorship? If we remember that the latent dream thoughts are not conscious before analysis, but that the manifest dream content emerging from them is consciously remembered, it is not a far-fetched assumption that admittance to the consciousness is the prerogative of the second agency. Nothing can reach the consciousness from the first system which has not previously passed the second instance, and the second instance lets nothing pass without exercising its rights, enforcing such modifications as are pleasing to itself upon the candidates for admission to consciousness. Here we arrive at a very definite conception of the essence of consciousness. For us, the state of becoming conscious is a special psychic act, different from and independent of the process of becoming fixed or represented, and consciousness appears to us as a sensory organ which perceives the content proceeding from another source. It may be shown that psychopathology simply cannot dispense with these fundamental assumptions, but we shall reserve for another time a more exhaustive examination of the subject. If I bear in mind the notion of the two psychic instances and their relation to the consciousness, I find in the sphere of politics a perfectly appropriate analogy to the extraordinary affection which I feel for my friend R, who is so disparaged in the dream interpretation. I refer to the political life of a state in which the ruler, jealous of his rights, and an active public opinion are in mutual conflict. The people, protesting against the actions of an unpopular official, demand his dismissal. The autocrat, on the other hand, in order to show his contempt for the popular will, may then deliberately confer upon the official some exceptional distinction which otherwise would not have been conferred. Similarly, my second instance, controlling the access to my consciousness, distinguishes my friend R with a brush of extraordinary affection, because the wish tendencies of the first system, in view of a particular interest in which they are just then intent, would like to disparage him as a simpleton. We may now perhaps begin to suspect that dream interpretation is capable of yielding information concerning the structure of our psychic apparatus, which we have hitherto vainly expected from philosophy. We shall not, however, follow up this trail, but shall return to our original problem as soon as we have elucidated the problem of dream distortion. The question arose how dreams with a disagreeable content can be analyzed as wish fulfillments. We see now that this is possible where a dream distortion has occurred, when the disagreeable content serves only to disguise the thing wished for. With regard to our assumptions respecting the two psychic instances, we can now also say that disagreeable dreams contain, as a matter of fact, something which is disagreeable to the second instance, but which at the same time fulfills a wish of the first instance. They are wish dreams in so far as every dream emanates from the first instance, while the second instance behaves towards the dream only in a defensive, not in a constructive manner. Were we to limit ourselves to a consideration of what the second instance contributes to the dream, we should never understand the dream, and all the problems which the writers on the subject have discovered in the dream would have to remain unsolved. That the dream actually has a secret meaning, which proves to be a wish fulfillment, must be proved afresh in every case by analysis. I will therefore select a few dreams which have painful contents, and endeavor to analyze them. Some of them are dreams of hysterical subjects, which therefore call for a long preliminary statement, and in some passages an examination of the psychic processes occurring in hysteria. This, though it will complicate the presentation, is unavoidable. When I treat a psychoneurotic patient analytically, his dreams regularly, as I have said, become a theme of our conversations. I must therefore give him all the psychological explanations with whose aid I myself have succeeded in understanding his symptoms. And here I encounter unsparing criticism, which is perhaps no less shrewd than that which I have to expect from my colleagues. With perfect uniformity, my patients contradict the doctrine that dreams are fulfillments of wishes. Here are several attempts of the sort of dream material which is adduced in refutation of my theory. You were always saying that a dream is a wish fulfilled, begins an intelligent lady patient. Now I shall tell you a dream in which the content is quite the opposite, in which a wish of mine is not fulfilled. How do you reconcile that with your theory? The dream was as follows. I want to give a supper, but I have nothing available except smoked salmon. I think I will go shopping, but I remember that it is Sunday afternoon, when all the shops are closed. I then try to ring up a few caterers, but the telephone is out of order. Accordingly, I have to renounce my desire to give a supper. I reply, of course, that only the analysis can decide the meaning of this dream, although I admit that at first sight it seems sensible and coherent and looks like the opposite of a wish fulfillment. But what occurrence gave rise to this dream? I ask. You know that the stimulus of a dream always lies among the experiences of the preceding day. End of section 13. Recording by Alicia in Philadelphia.